It is December 1940 in a small office above a delicatessen on 42nd Street, and a 19-year-old artist is drawing a man in a flag. Outside, the city is loud and cold and ordinary. Inside, nothing about what is happening feels historic. Two young men, a writer and an artist, are hunched over a drafting table under a bare bulb, arguing quietly about the angle of a punch. Neither of them knows yet that the character they are inventing to pay the rent will still be famous 100 years later. Neither of them knows that within weeks their publisher will need police protection. They only know one thing for certain, and it is the only thing that matters tonight. Somewhere across an ocean, in a country neither of them has ever visited, a man is currently deciding who lives and who doesn't, and almost nobody in this country wants to talk about it out loud yet. That is where this story actually begins. Not with a serum, not with a shield, with two Jewish kids from working-class New York drawing a picture of a man they wished someone, anyone, would be brave enough to become. Everything you think you know about Captain America, the frozen soldier, the impossible strength, the best friend who falls from a train, the war that made him, sits directly on top of a true one. A war that really happened, fought by real people, most of whom were ordinary, most of whom were terrified, most of whom did not have a serum or a shield or a plan. This is the story underneath the story. Settle in. You don't have to remember any of it, you just have to let it play. How a comic book character born 4 months before Pearl Harbor became one of the only fictional soldiers to fight a real war before his own country officially agreed to starts with two young men who were angry and broke and right. Chapter 1. The Wound. To understand why Captain America exists at all, you have to understand what it felt like to be paying attention in America in the winter of 1940 while pretending not to be. By then, the war in Europe was over a year old. Poland had fallen in the autumn of 1939, carved in half by Germany and the Soviet Union within weeks of each other, an alliance that shocked much of the world and would not survive its own betrayal for long. France, the country that so many Americans still pictured as impregnable, collapsed in 6 weeks in the spring of 1940, a defeat so fast and so total that military planners on both sides of the Atlantic spent years afterward trying to explain it. Britain stood alone through the summer and autumn of that year, enduring nightly bombing in what came to be called the Blitz, its cities burning in a way that newsreel audiences in American theaters watched in near silence, unsure whether they were watching someone else's war or a preview of their own. And in Germany, the machinery of the Holocaust, though that word did not yet exist in public use, was already turning. By the winter of 1940, Jewish citizens across German-controlled territory had been stripped of employment, property, and legal protection for years. Ghettos were being sealed in occupied Poland. The one in Łódź had been closed off since the spring, over 160,000 people locked behind a fence inside their own city. The mass shootings that would come to be known as the Holocaust by bullets were still ahead, and the death camps were not yet built, but the direction of the machine was already unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. Very few Americans were being asked to pay close attention. Isolationism was not a fringe position in 1940. It was closer to a majority instinct, shaped by the bitter memory of the First World War, and by a deep, cross-partisan conviction that Europe's quarrels were not America's to fix. This is the atmosphere that two young men named Simon and Jack Kirby were working inside when they created Captain America together at the very end of 1940 for a first issue that would carry a cover date of March 1941, a full 9 months before the United States would be dragged into the war by the attack on Pearl Harbor. Simon was 27. Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg, was 23. The son of Austrian Jewish immigrants who had grown up poor on the Lower East Side, in a neighborhood so rough that he later said learning to draw and learning to fight were both survival skills he'd picked up on the same streets, sometimes on the same afternoon. Both men were part of a wave of Jewish creators who had built the entire American comic book industry essentially from scratch in the late 1930s. Partly because so many other publishing and advertising industries at the time quietly refused to hire Jewish artists and writers. Comics were considered disreputable, a cheap, disposable medium for children beneath the notice of serious publishing, and that low status is exactly what made it one of the only creative industries open to them. They built an art form in the room nobody else wanted, and then, within a few years, that room produced some of the most enduring characters of the century. Simon and Kirby were not naive about what they were doing when they put a swastika and a real, identifiable depiction of Adolf Hitler on the cover of Captain America Comics #1, with Captain America punching him directly in the jaw. This was not a metaphorical villain, not a fictional dictator with a different name standing in for the real one, the way so much wartime fiction would later handle it more cautiously. It was Hitler himself, drawn recognizably, taking a haymaker from an American soldier in a flag on a comic book that would be sold on drugstore spinner racks to American children 9 months before America was at war with Germany at all. At the time, this was not a safe thing to publish. It was closer to a provocation, and both creators knew it. Simon later said the idea came directly from paying close attention to the news out of Europe and feeling a kind of helpless fury that nobody in a position of power seemed willing to say the obvious thing out loud, that Hitler needed to be stopped and that America's official policy of neutrality was functionally a policy of watching. Captain America was not created as an escapist power fantasy first. He was created as an argument. A drawn, inked, 4-color argument aimed directly at an American public that a huge and vocal portion of, at that exact moment, did not want to hear it. That distinction matters because it shapes everything else in this story. This was not a character invented after the war to help people process what had already happened. He was invented in the middle of the argument about whether the war should be fought at all, invented as a piece of ammunition in a domestic political fight that was still very much undecided. When you understand that, the shield stops being just a cool prop. It becomes something closer to a position paper. The publisher backing this position paper was Martin Goodman, running a small outfit that would eventually, through several name changes over the following decades, become Marvel Comics. Goodman was a shrewd businessman first and an idealist second, and it's worth sitting with that combination for a moment because it's part of what made the character possible. Simon and Kirby brought the politics and the fury. Goodman brought the calculation that a strong, controversial cover might actually sell better than a safe one. That outrage, even hostile outrage, moves copies off a rack. He was right, though not in the way any of them expected, and not without real personal risk attached to being right. Before we get to what happened next, and what happened next is the part almost nobody remembers, the part with police officers standing outside a comic book office, it's worth just sitting for a moment with the two of them at that drafting table. Two kids from immigrant families in a cold office in a city that mostly wanted to look away from what was happening across an ocean, deciding they weren't going to look away. Whatever else this story becomes, and it becomes a story about serums and secret armies and frozen bodies pulled out of the sea decades later, it starts here, small and specific and true. Two young men who were angry enough and talented enough to draw the thing they wished their country would say out loud. They finished the cover in the final weeks of 1940. Neither of them yet knew how the country would answer it. Chapter 2. Punching Hitler. Captain America Comics #1 hit newsstands in December of 1940, dated March 1941 the way magazines of the era were often dated ahead, and it sold close to 1 million copies. An extraordinary number for a new, untested title, more than 3 times what the publisher had expected. But sales figures are not the part of this chapter that matters most. What matters most is what arrived at the office in the weeks after. Threats arrived, real ones. The America First Committee, the largest and most organized isolationist movement in the country at the time, had hundreds of thousands of members and the public support of prominent figures, including the aviator Charles Lindbergh, who by 1941 was giving speeches arguing openly against American involvement in the war, and in at least one notorious address that autumn in Des Moines, blaming Jewish Americans, among other groups, for supposedly pushing the country toward war. This was not a marginal fringe position whispered in back rooms. It was argued from major stages, printed in major papers, and held by a very large share of the American public, who had buried 400,000 of their own countrymen in the previous World War less than a generation earlier, and did not intend to do it again for what they saw as someone else's fight. Alongside America First, there was the German-American Bund, an organization of American citizens and residents openly sympathetic to Nazi Germany, who had, less than 2 years before Captain America #1 hit newsstands, filled Madison Square Garden in New York City with over 20,000 people for a rally under a massive portrait of George Washington flanked by swastika banners. That rally happened in February of 1939, in the same city where Simon and Kirby would sit down the following year to draw a Nazi getting punched in the jaw. This is not incidental background noise. It is the literal neighborhood the comic was published into. The Bund had a real, organized, sometimes violent presence in New York at exactly the moment this comic hit the stands. According to later interviews with Joe Simon, once the comic's content became widely known, the publisher's office began receiving phone calls, some hostile, some outright threatening, along with a volume of hate mail he described as unlike anything else the small studio had experienced. The details have been recounted slightly differently across different interviews over the decades, as memories of any single office in any single winter tend to be, but the through line every account agrees on is this. The reaction was serious enough and specific enough that New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia personally arranged for police protection for the studio. According to Simon, the mayor called their office directly to offer it. Sit with that for a second. A mayor of the largest city in the country felt it necessary to have police stationed to protect a comic book studio from its own readers and neighbors, because those readers and neighbors were angry enough about a drawing of a fictional soldier hitting a real dictator that the studio's staff had reason to fear for their physical safety. This was the temperature of the argument Captain America walked into, not applause, not universal patriotic celebration. A fight, a real one, fought with phone calls and threats, and, for a period of weeks, uniformed officers standing outside a door on 42nd Street. It's worth pausing here to say plainly what a lot of retellings of this story skip past. The people threatening a comic book studio in early 1941 for depicting Hitler as a villain were not a lunatic fringe operating entirely outside respectable society. Isolationism, and in some ugly corners of it, outright sympathy for the Axis cause, ran through parts of mainstream American political and cultural life at the time. Henry Ford, one of the most famous industrialists in the country, had spent much of the 1920s funding and publishing anti-Semitic material that Nazi propagandists later cited approvingly. Lindbergh, days after Captain America #1 was published, would go on to accept the Service Cross of the German Eagle, a medal from the Nazi government years earlier, a decoration he never returned even as the war intensified. None of this means most Americans were sympathetic to fascism, most were not. But the country's official position, right up until December 7, 1941, was neutrality, and a substantial, well-funded, well-connected portion of the public actively wanted to keep it that way, by whatever means necessary. A comic book that said otherwise, loudly with a swastika on the cover, was picking a real fight in real time, not looking back at a settled moral consensus, the way it can feel like now, 8 decades and a total Allied victory later. Simon and Kirby did not stop. If anything, the studio leaned harder into the character over the following issues, continuing to depict Nazi villains, saboteurs, and fifth-column plots explicitly, while the United States government itself was still not at war. It is genuinely difficult to find another mainstream piece of American popular culture from that specific 9-month window, December 1940 to December 1941, that took as unambiguous and personally risky a public stance against Nazi Germany as this comic book aimed at children did. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,400 Americans in a single morning, and 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, resolving the isolationist debate not through persuasion but through catastrophe. The country that had been arguing furiously with itself for over 2 years was, within a single week, unified. Not happily, not without dissent that would continue in various forms, but functionally, urgently unified behind total war. Captain America Comics, which had spent its first year as a controversial minority position, became almost overnight one of the most commercially successful and culturally unremarkable choices imaginable. A patriotic hero fighting Nazis, published by a country now formally and completely committed to fighting Nazis. The character's politics didn't change even slightly. The country simply suddenly caught up to them. There is something worth sitting with in that timeline, quietly, without needing to draw too hard a lesson from it. The version of the story people tend to remember is simple. A hero was created to fight Nazis during World War II. The truer, stranger version is that a hero was created to fight Nazis during an American debate about whether to fight Nazis at all, created by two people who took real, personal risk for that position before their own government agreed with them, and who were vindicated by an attack that had nothing to do with the argument they'd actually been having. History rarely resolves an argument on the terms it was being argued in. It just ends the argument from outside all at once, and everyone has to live with whichever side they were standing on when it did. Simon and Jack Kirby, as it happened, were standing on the side that turned out to be right. But for one full year, nobody could have promised them that in advance. They drew the punch before they knew the country would ever agree to throw one. Chapter 3: The Real Super Soldier Race. The version of the origin most people carry around in their heads goes something like this. A frail young man, rejected by the army for being too weak, is given an experimental serum that turns him into the peak of human strength and speed. The formula then lost forever when the scientist who created it is killed. It's a clean story, built for a comic page, but it sits directly on top of a real and considerably stranger history, one where multiple countries, including the one telling this story, really were trying to engineer better soldiers out of ordinary human bodies, using the actual science available to them at the time, with results that ranged from genuinely useful to genuinely horrifying. Start with Germany, because Germany is where the darkest version of this idea was pursued furthest, and because Nazi human experimentation is one of the most heavily documented atrocities of the entire war, precisely because so much of the documentation was seized intact by Allied forces at the end of it. This was not, contrary to a lot of loose popular imagination, a coordinated single program chasing a comic book strength serum. It was a sprawling, decentralized set of criminal medical experiments carried out primarily on concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, and other people the regime had already stripped of legal protection, run by doctors, actual licensed physicians, university-trained, some with respected pre-war careers, who used camp inmates as unconsenting subjects for research into altitude sickness, hypothermia, infectious disease, and, yes, in some documented cases, stimulant drugs intended to reduce fatigue and increase aggression in soldiers, including a methamphetamine-based compound distributed to German troops on a scale historians now believe numbered in the tens of millions of doses across the war. None of it produced anything resembling a super soldier. Much of it produced only suffering and death, and after the war 23 doctors and officials were tried at Nuremberg specifically for these medical crimes, in what came to be known as the Doctors' Trial, a proceeding whose written judgment, the Nuremberg Code, became the founding document of modern medical ethics regarding informed consent, precisely because of what these doctors had done without it. The United States, it's worth being honest, was not experimenting on prisoners at Auschwitz, but it was not innocent of unethical human research during this same era either. The most notorious American case, the Tuskegee syphilis study, had already been running for nearly a decade by the time Captain America #1 hit newsstands, and would continue unconscionably for another 3 decades after the war ended, a study in which the US Public Health Service tracked but deliberately did not treat syphilis in hundreds of black men in Alabama, many of whom were never even told what disease they had, let alone offered the penicillin that became a standard cure partway through the study's run. It is not a coincidence, decades later, that when Marvel itself decided to tell a more honest, harder story about race and the super soldier program, it invented a character named Isaiah Bradley, a black soldier subjected to a version of the serum experiment without meaningful consent, explicitly modeled on Tuskegee. That later story was, in its own way, the comic finally catching up to a truth its own premise had always been standing next to. Away from the atrocities, there was also real, legitimate, life-saving, wartime medical science chasing something that, from a distance, doesn't look so different from a super soldier program. It's just that almost nobody remembers it that way, because it wasn't about strength, it was about survival. Charles Drew, an African-American physician and surgeon, developed and organized techniques for the large-scale collection, processing, and storage of blood plasma in the years just before and during the war, work that became the operational backbone of the Blood for Britain program and later the American Red Cross's blood banking system. A system that saved an almost incalculable number of lives on battlefields where a soldier's chance of survival after a serious wound often came down to how quickly plasma could reach him. Drew himself resigned from the Red Cross blood program in 1942 in protest of a policy, later relaxed but not eliminated, that segregated blood donations by race. A detail that sits in exactly the same uncomfortable space as the Isaiah Bradley story does. A reminder that the machinery keeping soldiers alive was being built brilliantly by people the country they were saving still refused to treat as full citizens. There was penicillin, mass-produced for the first time at wartime scale starting in 1943 after years of painstaking development, arriving just in time to prevent infected wounds from becoming automatic death sentences the way they so often had been in the previous World War. There was the development of better field surgery, better triage, better blood typing, faster evacuation, none of it as dramatic as a glowing vial of serum, all of it doing more to keep ordinary soldiers alive and functional than any single miracle drug in fiction ever could. And then there were the drugs that really were handed out to keep soldiers going on both sides in enormous quantities, not to make them superhuman, but simply to keep exhausted, frightened young men moving and alert for days at a stretch. Benzodrine and amphetamine was issued to American and British aircrews and infantry to combat fatigue. German forces, as mentioned, distributed a methamphetamine compound under the brand name Pervitin so widely that soldiers sometimes called it in letters home simply tank chocolate, crediting it with the astonishing, sleepless pace of the 1940 invasion of France. None of this created a Captain America. What it created, on both sides of the war, was a generation of exhausted young men chemically propped upright long enough to keep fighting, some of whom carried the dependency home with them when the war ended, an invisible cost of a very visible war. So the true history behind the serum is not one secret formula, lost with one scientist's death. It's a much larger, much stranger constellation. Real atrocities committed by real doctors on real prisoners in the name of building better soldiers. Real, legitimate, heroic medical innovation that actually did save enormous numbers of lives, often built by people whose own country denied them full citizenship while they did it. And a quieter, sadder story of ordinary chemical stimulants handed to ordinary, exhausted teenagers on both sides of a war so vast it eventually needed nearly every method available, moral or not, to keep it running. The comic book version compresses all of that into a single glowing vial and a scientist killed before he can make a second one. It's a kinder story than the real one. Most of the good stories are. Chapter 4. Bucky and the Boy Soldiers. In the comics, Bucky Barnes is introduced as a teenager, the camp mascot, who somehow stumbles onto Steve Rogers' secret identity and is folded into the war effort as his young partner, fighting alongside a grown man despite being, by any reasonable standard, a child. Generations of readers have quietly accepted this as one of the more far-fetched details in an already far-fetched premise. A teenager on the front lines, armed, fighting alongside adults in a world war. It was not far-fetched. It happened over and over, on a scale that is honestly a little startling once you start looking at it directly. The official minimum age for US military enlistment during the Second World War was 18, with 17-year-olds permitted to join only with parental consent, and even that lower bound was regularly, quietly ignored. Historians who have studied enlistment fraud during the war estimate that hundreds of thousands of underage boys managed to enlist in the American armed forces alone, some through forged birth certificates, some by simply lying to recruiters who, especially in the early rush after Pearl Harbor, were not always inclined to look very closely at a boy who was tall for his age and desperate to go. The most famous individual case is Calvin Graham, a Texas boy who enlisted in the US. Navy at the age of 12 by claiming to be 17, and who served aboard the battleship USS South Dakota during the brutal naval battles around Guadalcanal in November of 1942, where he was wounded by shrapnel and later decorated for his conduct under fire, before the Navy discovered his true age, at which point, rather than being honoured for surviving actual combat as a child, he was arrested and briefly imprisoned for fraud, his medal stripped, a decision the Navy did not formally reverse and restore his benefits for until decades later, after considerable public pressure. He was 12 years old in a naval battle. Bucky Barnes, by comparison, reads as almost restrained. Britain and other Allied and Axis nations had their own versions of this same story, sometimes far more organised and far darker than individual cases of a boy lying about his age to a recruiter. Toward the very end of the war, as Germany's manpower collapsed under years of catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front and relentless attrition in the West, the regime formally began conscripting members of the Hitler Youth into combat units, arming boys as young as 12 and 14 with anti-tank weapons to defend against advancing Soviet and Allied forces in the war's final desperate months, an act that was not covert enlistment fraud slipping past a recruiter but explicit official state policy, sending children to die in a war their own leadership had already, by any rational military assessment, lost. Some of the last defenders of Berlin in the final days of the war before its fall in May of 1945 were children. Even setting aside outright underage service, the average age of American servicemen in World War II was young in a way that's easy to forget once a war becomes history rather than headlines. The majority of enlisted men were in their late teens and early 20s, plucked out of high schools, farms and factory jobs and placed, often within months, into the most violent and terrifying circumstances most of them would ever face, expected to make life and death decisions under fire that would be a lot to ask of anyone twice their age. A great many of the men storming the beaches at Normandy in June of 1944, or holding the line during the brutal winter fighting of the Battle of the Bulge that December, were 19, 20, 21 years old, barely past the age comic book readers were told to find implausible in a supporting sidekick. There's a particular kind of quiet grief buried in this fact, one that the comic book version of Bucky, for all its later tragedy, only gestures toward. In the fiction, Bucky's death is a singular, devastating loss. The best friend, fallen from a train, a wound that defines the hero for the rest of the story. In the actual war, that exact shape of loss, a young man barely past boyhood, gone suddenly and violently, leaving behind someone who carries it for the rest of their life, happened to real families by the hundreds of thousands. Just over 400,000 American service members died in World War II. The overwhelming majority of them were young enough that, under any other circumstance, in any other decade, we would still be calling them kids. So when the comic asks you to accept that a teenager fought a world war alongside a grown man in a mask, it isn't actually asking you to suspend much disbelief at all. It's asking you to accept something that was, in the driest and most literal historical sense, true, just usually true without a mask, without a super soldier serum, without a comic book ending, usually true in the form of a forged birth certificate, a recruiter who didn't ask twice, and a family back home that got a telegram instead of a homecoming. If you're getting sleepy now, that's all right. Let the details soften. What matters, underneath all the specifics, is simple and worth carrying with you into sleep. The young were asked to carry an enormous amount in that war, on every side of it, and a great many of them did. Quietly, without a shield, without a serum, without their names remembered afterward the way Bucky Barnes' fictional name has been remembered for over 80 years running. Somewhere in that gap, between the boys history forgot and the one comic panel still remembers, is most of what this whole story is actually about. Chapter 5: The Howling Commandos and the Real Shadow War. Later Captain America stories, especially once the character was revived and expanded decades after the war, gave him a unit, a small, elite, multinational team of specialists dropped behind enemy lines to do the kind of work regular armies couldn't: sabotage, rescue, precision strikes against targets too sensitive or too well hidden for a conventional assault. It's a compelling image, and like almost everything else in this story, it wasn't invented out of nothing. It was built quite closely on real organizations that really did exist, doing work that in some cases was even stranger than the fiction that followed it. The most direct real-world ancestor is the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, created in 1942 as the United States' first centralized intelligence and special operations agency, the direct forerunner of what would later become the CIA. The OSS ran spies, saboteurs, and guerrilla support teams across occupied Europe and Asia throughout the war, working with resistance movements in France, Yugoslavia, Burma, and elsewhere, often parachuted into hostile or contested territory with little more than a radio, some explosives, and instructions to make trouble for the occupying force until the front line eventually caught up to them. Its first director, William Wild Bill Donovan, was a decorated First World War veteran and lawyer whom Franklin Roosevelt personally tapped to build an American intelligence apparatus essentially from scratch, borrowing heavily from British intelligence methods and, in the process, creating an organization whose culture, improvisational, secretive, staffed by an unusual mix of Ivy League academics, safecrackers, and career soldiers, became legendary enough that its structure and mythology fed directly into decades of later spy fiction. One of the OSS's most concrete achievements along these lines was its role in coordinating with the Jedburgh teams, small three-person units, typically one American or British officer, one French officer, and one radio operator, parachuted into occupied France in the weeks around the June 1944 D-Day invasion to link up with, arm, and coordinate French resistance fighters, disrupting German communications and troop movements at exactly the moment the Allied invasion force most needed the enemy's rear lines thrown into chaos. Roughly 93 of these small teams dropped into France that summer, working in territory where capture typically meant torture and execution rather than the standard treatment of a prisoner of war, since resistance fighters and the operatives supporting them were frequently treated by German forces as illegal combatants rather than soldiers. Then there's the 1st Special Service Force, an elite joint American-Canadian commando unit formed in 1942, trained for winter warfare, mountain fighting, and demolitions, and known to the enemy troops they fought in the brutal Italian campaign as the Devil's Brigade, a nickname supposedly taken from a captured German officer's diary entry describing them as devils who left no survivors. The unit's shoulder patch, worn with genuine pride by its surviving veterans for the rest of their lives, combined the American and Canadian flags into a single crossed arrow design, a small, real detail that echoes, oddly precisely, the fictional idea of a small international team fighting under one shared insignia decades before any comic book got around to inventing one. Derby's Rangers, formerly the 1st Ranger Battalion, were another real formation cut from similar cloth, an elite American light infantry unit modelled directly on British commando training, formed in 1942 under Lieutenant Colonel William Derby, specifically to spearhead the most dangerous amphibious assaults of the North African and Italian campaigns, landing ahead of the main force to seize key positions before the enemy could properly organise a defence. Rangers took catastrophic casualties in some of these operations. The assault at Cisterna in early 1944 all but destroyed 2 of the battalion's companies, most of the men killed or captured in a single failed operation behind German lines, a reminder that the real version of this kind of glamorous, dangerous, elite small team versus impossible odds warfare very often ended not in a daring rescue but in exactly the kind of quiet catastrophe that doesn't make it into an origin story. There is also a specific sobering irony worth sitting with in the fictional team's later editions, which over the decades of the comic's history came to include a black soldier and a Japanese-American soldier serving openly, without controversy, as full and equal members of an elite integrated combat unit. That detail, more than almost any other in the whole mythology, was not close to how the real war actually worked. The American armed forces of World War II were formally, officially segregated by race for the entire duration of the conflict, and Japanese Americans specifically were treated by their own government not as trusted potential soldiers first, but overwhelmingly as suspects. Over 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the majority of them American citizens by birth, forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast and held in incarceration camps under executive order, beginning in early 1942 without individual charges, without trials, purely on the basis of ethnicity, at the same moment the country was fighting a war it framed publicly as a defense of freedom and democracy. That contradiction, a country fighting fascism abroad while running its own military, and in the case of Japanese Americans, its own civilian population, through a segregated and in places explicitly discriminatory system at home, sits at the center of the next part of this story, and it deserves its own full space rather than a passing mention here. For now, let the Shadow War part of this settle. Small teams really did drop behind enemy lines. Real men really were trained for exactly the kind of impossible, high-stakes sabotage missions comic books later made glamorous. Some of them really did wear a shared insignia and consider themselves something closer to family than to a military unit. And a great many more of them than any story likes to admit did not come home to tell anyone about it. Chapter 6. A Segregated Army. Here is the fact that sits underneath almost everything else in this story. quiet and heavy, the one the comic book version spent decades not quite finding a way to talk about, the American military that Captain America was drawn to represent, in a war framed from its very first newsreel as a fight against a regime built on racial supremacy, was itself organized by federal policy along strict racial lines. Black Americans served in World War II in enormous numbers. Roughly 1.25 million African Americans served in the US armed forces over the course of the war, and they served almost entirely within a segregated structure that had been official military policy since the earliest days of the country's armed forces and would not be formally abolished until President Truman's executive order in 1948. 3 full years after the war, Captain America is supposedly fighting had already ended. Black soldiers trained in segregated units, often on segregated bases, frequently commanded by white officers regardless of the qualifications or seniority of black non-commissioned officers beneath them. In the Jim Crow American South, where a great many military training bases happened to be located, black servicemen in full American uniform were routinely denied service at restaurants, movie theaters, and bus seating that German prisoners of war held on the very same bases were, in a detail that stunned many black soldiers and civil rights observers at the time, sometimes permitted to use freely. A man could be captured fighting for Hitler and be served a meal at a lunch counter that would refuse the American soldier guarding him. Despite this, black units compiled combat records that stand among the most distinguished of the entire war, records that took decades of advocacy to receive anything close to proper recognition. The Tuskegee Airmen, the first black military aviators in American history, trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama starting in 1941 after years of resistance from a military establishment that had long claimed, in official studies, that black servicemen lacked the intelligence and temperament for combat aviation. Flew thousands of combat missions over North Africa and Europe, escorting American bombers deep into enemy territory, and developed a reputation among the bomber crews they protected as unusually disciplined escorts who rarely abandoned a formation to chase individual kills, a discipline that saved a great many bomber crews' lives and earned the Tuskegee-trained pilots real, if grudging and slow-arriving, respect within a service that had insisted, in writing, they would fail. Not a single one of the Tuskegee Airmen received the Medal of Honor at the time of the war. It took until 2007, over 60 years later, for a group of the surviving Tuskegee Airmen to be collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, and it was not until 1997, more than half a century after the fact, that Vernon Baker, one of the very few black soldiers to serve as a combat infantry officer during the war, became the only living black World War II veteran to receive the Medal of Honor, following a Pentagon review that finally corrected a record in which not a single black service member had been awarded the nation's highest military honor for actions during the entire war, despite extensive documented heroism, until that review forced the issue 52 years after VE Day. The 92nd Infantry Division, one of the few black infantry divisions to see combat in the European theatre, fought through the brutal mountainous Italian campaign in conditions that ground down even well-supplied, well-regarded units, while facing skepticism and at points open hostility from within the very command structure they served under, some of which was later documented as having unfairly shaped the division's historical reputation regardless of the genuine bravery of many of its soldiers on the ground. The Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy logistics operation that kept Allied forces supplied with fuel and munitions during the fast-moving advance across France in the autumn of 1944, an operation without which the entire pace of the Allied liberation of Western Europe would have stalled, was staffed overwhelmingly by black soldiers driving around the clock, often through contested and dangerous roads, in an assignment that was itself a reflection of segregation, since black soldiers were disproportionately funneled into support and logistics roles regardless of individual qualification, and yet one that turned out to be genuinely indispensable to the entire military campaign it supported. This is the actual uncomfortable ground that a decades later Captain America storyline was reaching for when Marvel finally introduced Isaiah Bradley in a 2003 series called Truth, Red, White, and Black. A story that reimagined the super soldier program as having first been tested without informed consent and with a horrifying rate of fatal side effects on a group of black soldiers, explicitly and deliberately paralleling the real history of the Tuskegee syphilis study and the broader, well-documented pattern of the US government and military treating black bodies as expendable testing ground in the name of a progress that would then be handed, safely refined, to a white soldier as the story's public hero. It was a genuinely bold thing for a mainstream superhero comic to do this directly to its own flagship character's origin, to say explicitly that the story you've been told, the clean one, the one with a heroic scientist and a willing volunteer, sits directly on top of an uglier and more familiar American pattern. It didn't undo 8 decades of a simpler myth, but it planted, finally, inside the character's own official history, an acknowledgement of the segregated, unequal country that had actually produced him. There's no tidy resolution to offer at the end of this chapter, and it wouldn't be honest to invent one. The Tuskegee Airmen flew brilliantly and came home to a country that still would not seat them at its lunch counters. The Red Ball Express kept an entire advancing army fed and fueled and is barely remembered by name outside specialist military history. Vernon Baker waited 52 years for a medal that, by any fair accounting of the facts, was earned the moment he earned it, in combat, in 1945. The shield in the comic is bright and clean and never seems to tarnish. The country underneath it, the real one, was not so simple and did not deserve yet to have a story told about it that pretended otherwise. Let that sit for a while as you drift. It's not a comfortable fact, it's a true one, and it belongs in this story as much as anything else does. Chapter 7. The Ice. In the fiction, the war ends for Captain America not with a parade or a surrender ceremony, but with a plane, a bomb, and a freezing ocean, a final mission that goes wrong, a hero who chooses to crash an experimental aircraft into the Arctic rather than let it reach its target, and a body preserved in ice for decades, discovered and revived long after the war he fought in had passed into history. It's one of the most striking images in the entire mythology. The soldier who never really got to see the peace he helped win, frozen at the exact moment of his own sacrifice, waking up into a future that has moved on without him. Real cold-weather warfare during the Second World War did not produce frozen supermen who woke up decades later. It produced something both more mundane and, in its own way, more haunting. Enormous numbers of ordinary soldiers who died of exposure, frostbite, and hypothermia, sometimes in numbers that rivaled or exceeded combat casualties in a given campaign, and a smaller number of genuinely eerie, well-documented cases of bodies preserved by extreme cold and recovered, sometimes astonishingly intact, years or even decades after they were lost. The Battle of the Bulge, fought in the brutally cold Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg beginning in December 1944, remains the largest single battle American forces fought in the entire war, and it was fought in one of the coldest winters the region had experienced in years, with temperatures regularly dropping well below freezing, snow burying roads and equipment, and American soldiers, many still equipped with summer-weight gear because the rapid advance across France that autumn had led planners to assume, wrongly, that the war in Europe would be over before winter set in, suffering an appalling rate of frostbite and trench foot alongside their combat wounds. Some American units in the Ardennes reported cold weather casualties, meaning men taken out of action by frostbite and exposure rather than enemy fire, at rates that approached, or in some cases matched, their combat casualty rates, a detail that rarely makes it into popular retellings of the battle's famous last stands and daring relief columns. The Winter War, fought between Finland and the Soviet Union from late 1939 into early 1940, technically a separate, earlier conflict from the main Second World War, but deeply entangled with it, since the Soviet Union's invasion of Finland came directly out of the same 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had carved up Poland, produced conditions and casualty patterns that remain some of the most extreme cold-weather warfare on record. Temperatures during the campaign reportedly dropped below -40 degrees at points, and Finnish forces, considerably smaller and more lightly equipped than the invading Soviet army, but far better adapted to fighting in their own brutal winter terrain on skis and in white camouflage, inflicted catastrophic losses on Soviet columns that were frequently caught strung out along narrow forest roads, unable to maneuver, freezing in place. Photographs from the war of Soviet soldiers frozen upright, sometimes still seated at the wheel of a stalled vehicle or crouched where they fell, circulated after the conflict and remain some of the starkest visual documents of what extreme cold does to an army caught unprepared for it. An image that sits uncomfortably close to the fictional image of a single frozen hero waiting to be found, except multiplied by the thousands, with no revival waiting for any of them. There are also real, individually documented cases of remains recovered from ice and snow, long after the fact, some decades later, preserved well enough by the cold to be identified. Aircraft that went down over glaciers, mountain ranges, and the frozen North Atlantic during the war have periodically been rediscovered by later expeditions and researchers as ice sheets shift and melt in a slow, ongoing process that continues into the present day. Melting glacial ice in places like Alaska, Greenland, and the Alps has, in the decades since the war, occasionally revealed wreckage and remains from wartime crashes, sometimes allowing families to finally receive identification and closure for a loss that had simply been recorded for 70 or 80 years as missing. The B-17 bomber known as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, among other Greenland ice cap crash sites from the war, drew expeditions decades later specifically because cold, dry ice environments preserve wreckage and, in some documented cases, human remains in a state closer to suspension than decay. Not indefinitely, and not in any way that resembles fictional revival, but well enough that recovery efforts undertaken generations after a loss have sometimes still been able to identify who was lost, and finally bring a name home to a family that had spent most of a lifetime not knowing. There is something almost unbearably tender, if you sit with it slowly enough, in the actual, non-fictional versions of this idea. A plane that goes down in ice in 1943, and a recovery team, decades later, in a different century, finally finding enough to identify a name and notify a family that had long since stopped expecting an answer. It's not a hero waking up. It's something quieter and, in its way, sadder and more true. An ending finally arriving, very late, for people who had already spent most of their lives waiting for one. The comic book version gives its frozen soldier a second chance nobody else in this whole true history ever actually got. Maybe that's part of why it stayed so powerful for so long. It takes one of the war's most common, coldest, least cinematic forms of loss, a body lost to ice, a family left without an answer, and it grants it, just once, in fiction, the ending that almost nobody in the real winters of 1939 through 1945 was ever allowed to have. Let yourself rest in that thought for a moment, however you want to hold it. It's all right now. You can let your eyes stay closed through the rest of this. Chapter 8, The False Peak. Every version of this story eventually arrives at a victory that doesn't quite feel finished, and it's worth spending a little time in that particular specific kind of unfinished feeling because it turns out to be one of the most historically accurate emotional notes in the entire mythology, even though nobody designed it that way on purpose. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, arrived on May 8, 1945, following Germany's unconditional surrender the day before, and it was met, understandably, with enormous, spontaneous celebration across the Allied world. Crowds filling Times Square and Trafalgar Square, church bells ringing, strangers embracing in the street. It is remembered, correctly, as one of the great collective releases of relief in the 20th century. But it's worth sitting with how incomplete that victory actually was on the ground for the people living through it in ways the single clean word victory tends to smooth over. The war in the Pacific was nowhere near finished on VE Day. Japan would not surrender for another 3.5 months, and the intervening summer included some of the deadliest fighting of the entire war. The Battle of Okinawa, which had begun in April and continued into late June, produced casualties among American, Japanese, and Okinawan civilian populations that numbered well over 100,000 dead combined, making it one of the bloodiest single campaigns of the entire Pacific War, unfolding at the very same time European crowds were celebrating an ending. For millions of American servicemen who had just survived years of fighting in Europe, VE Day did not mean going home. It meant, for a great many of them, the genuine and immediate fear of being redeployed to the Pacific for an anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands that military planners, before the atomic bombings in August finally forced Japan's surrender, expected could produce American casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Victory in one theater, for the men who'd won it, often felt less like an ending than like a terrifying pause before a second war nobody wanted to fight. Even within Europe itself, the surrender did not instantly resolve into order. The concentration and death camps that Allied forces had liberated in the preceding months, Bergen-Belsen in April, Buchenwald and Dachau within days of each other that same spring, had exposed soldiers and, soon after, the wider public to the direct physical evidence of the Holocaust on a scale that even those who had believed the earlier reports found difficult to fully absorb. General Eisenhower, upon touring the Ohrdruf camp in April 1945, reportedly insisted on having as many soldiers as possible walk through it and ordered extensive photographic documentation, specifically because he anticipated that people in the future would try to deny what had happened, and he wanted an evidentiary record too large and too well witnessed to dismiss. That single instinct? The fear that this would be denied unless documented overwhelmingly in the very week of the war's own European ending, is its own quiet acknowledgement that victory and resolution are not the same thing. The killing had stopped. The reckoning with what exactly had been allowed to happen and why and who bore responsibility and what debt was owed to the survivors was only just beginning and in many respects continues into the present day. Millions of displaced people, survivors of the camps, former forced labourers, refugees who had lost their homes, their countries, or entire family lines, had nowhere immediately to go in the war's aftermath, filling displaced persons camps across Europe for years after the fighting stopped, some for the better part of a decade, waiting for resettlement, for immigration quotas that many countries, including the United States, kept frustratingly restrictive even after the full scope of the Holocaust was documented and undeniable. The State of Israel would not be established until 1948, 3 years after the war's end, arising directly out of this unresolved post-war displacement and the international reckoning, however incomplete, with what statelessness had cost European Jewry. And for the individual returning soldier, even one who came home physically whole, from a war that had by any measure been won, the peace itself often arrived as its own kind of unfinished business. What would later be recognized and named as post-traumatic stress was, in 1945, still mostly understood through the blunter, less clinical language of the era: shell shock, battle fatigue, combat exhaustion, and treatment, to the extent it was offered at all, was inconsistent, often stigmatized, and frequently simply absent. Divorce rates rose sharply in the years immediately following the war. Alcoholism among veterans was widespread and rarely discussed as a medical consequence of what they'd survived rather than a personal failing. Millions of men who had spent years watching friends die came home to a country eager to celebrate a clean victory and move forward, not always equipped or even particularly willing to sit with how unfinished the war actually remained inside the people who'd fought it. This is the real, historical version of what the fiction reaches for with its false peak. The mission that looks like the end but isn't. The victory that leaves something crucial unresolved. In the comic, that unresolved thing is a body lost in ice and a partner's death never quite processed. In the real history underneath it, the unresolved thing was almost everything. A second war still raging in the Pacific, camps freshly liberated into a horror too large to immediately comprehend, millions of displaced people with nowhere to go, and an entire generation of returning soldiers carrying wounds that mostly had no name yet and even less treatment. The war ended. Peace, in the fuller, more human sense of the word, took a great deal longer to arrive for some people than any surrender document was able to promise. Chapter 9. The Real Propaganda Machine. There's a detail in some retellings of the Captain America story where, before he ever sees real combat, Steve Rogers is put to work not as a soldier but as a performer, sent on tour to sell war bonds, dressed in his costume, punching a fake Hitler on a stage in front of crowds, more mascot than soldier, more advertisement than weapon. It's usually played, in the fiction, as a humiliation, a taste of the glory the character actually wants, without the substance of it, until he finally escapes the stage and gets to the real fighting. That detail, more than almost any other in this whole mythology, is drawn nearly whole cloth from a real and enormous American wartime institution, and understanding how enormous it actually was changes how you might read the humiliation framing entirely. War bond drives were not a minor sideshow to the American war effort. They were one of its central financial engines. The US government sold roughly $185 billion in war bonds over the course of the conflict, an amount adjusted for the scale of the economy at the time, so large that it funded a very substantial share of the entire American war effort. And the government pursued that sum through one of the most sophisticated and relentless public persuasion campaigns in the country's history, enlisting Hollywood, radio, comic books, professional athletes, and the biggest celebrities of the era as pitchmen and performers. This was not incidental marketing. It was treated correctly as a matter of genuine strategic importance, on par with any single production quota, because an army that has run out of money to pay for shells and fuel loses a war just as surely as one that runs out of soldiers. Movie stars toured the country selling bonds in campaigns that drew crowds numbering in the tens of thousands. The actress Carole Lombard, one of the biggest film stars of the era and the wife of Clark Gable, died in a plane crash in January 1942 while returning from precisely this kind of war bond rally in Indiana, becoming the first American woman killed in service to the war effort, a detail that underlines just how seriously these tours, however glamorous and performative they might have looked from the outside, were actually treated, and how real the risk and the sacrifice behind them genuinely was, even for people who never set foot on an actual battlefield. The USO, the United Service Organizations, founded in 1941 specifically to coordinate live entertainment and morale support for American troops, sent performers overseas, sometimes disturbingly close to active combat zones, throughout the war. Bob Hope became the most famous face of this entire effort, touring extensively through active and recently active theaters, performing for audiences of exhausted, homesick young servicemen in conditions that were sometimes genuinely dangerous, and he continued doing so for decades after the war ended across Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War, in a tradition of morale entertainment directly descended from what began in 1941. Glenn Miller, one of the most popular band leaders in the country, gave up a lucrative civilian career to lead a military band entertaining troops throughout Europe, and disappeared over the English Channel in December 1944 on a flight to a scheduled performance in liberated Paris. His body and aircraft never recovered. Another entertainer whose wartime service ended not in triumphant homecoming but in the same kind of unresolved, unrecovered loss suffered by so many combat soldiers in this story, despite never having carried a weapon into battle himself. Comic books, meanwhile, were not merely tolerated as wartime entertainment. They were treated by publishers, and to a real, if less official degree by the government itself, as a genuine tool of persuasion aimed specifically at younger readers and, through them, their households. Nearly every major superhero character published during the war years appeared at some point punching Axis villains, urging readers to buy bonds and stamps, collect scrap metal, or plant a victory garden, in stories printed directly alongside actual advertisements for war bonds aimed at the same young readership. Superman himself appeared in Bond Drive promotional material distributed through comics and other channels. This was, in the most literal sense, a coordinated cultural mobilization, treating the imagination of American children as a resource worth actively cultivating in service of the war effort, in exactly the same spirit that treated scrap rubber drives and victory gardens as worth cultivating. So the fictional detail of Steve Rogers performing on a war bond stage in a bright costume, punching a fake villain for a paying crowd while the real war goes on somewhere else without him, isn't really an embarrassing detour invented to delay the real story. It's a remarkably accurate snapshot of an entire real wartime economy of performance and persuasion that ran alongside and in genuine material ways helped fund the actual fighting. An economy that, in the case of people like Carole Lombard and Glenn Miller, extracted a real and permanent cost from performers who never picked up a rifle at all. The stage was not separate from the war. For an enormous number of participants on both sides of the footlights, the stage was where a very real piece of the war was actually being fought and paid for. Somewhere in this detail is a small, quiet reminder worth carrying with you as you drift further into sleep. Heroism in that war did not only look like a soldier in a foxhole, it also looked like a singer on a troop ship deck 100 miles from the nearest safe harbor, or a movie star boarding a plane home from a Bond rally in Indiana that she would not survive. The line between the theater of the war and the war itself in 1942, in 1943, in 1944 was a great deal thinner than most retellings, comic book or otherwise, tend to let on. Chapter 10. The post-war vanishing. Here is a piece of the story that almost never makes it into the movies, because it isn't dramatic in the way a battle is dramatic. It's slower, quieter, and in its own way sadder. Once the actual war ended, Captain America, the character who had been created specifically as an argument for fighting it, largely stopped making sense to the audience that had once needed him so badly, and for the better part of 2 decades, he all but disappeared. Sales on the character's solo title declined steadily through the late 1940s, and the publisher, casting around for a way to keep the property relevant in a country no longer at war with the enemy it had been built to punch, tried retooling him briefly in the early 1950s as Captain America Commie Smasher, pitting him against Soviet infiltrators and domestic communist plots instead of Nazi saboteurs, a retooling that reflected the country's rapid pivot from the Second World War into the Cold War and the domestic anxieties of McCarthyism, but one that never recaptured anything close to the character's wartime popularity, and the title was cancelled within a couple of years. Making things considerably worse for the entire industry Simon and Kirby had helped build was a broader, genuinely damaging moral panic that swept through American comics in the mid-1950s, driven substantially by a single book, psychiatrist Frederick Wertham's 1954 Seduction of the Innocent, which argued, with a level of scientific rigor that later researchers found deeply questionable and in places outright fabricated, that comic books were directly responsible for juvenile delinquency, corrupting American youth through violent and, in Wertham's reading, sometimes coded homosexual or otherwise transgressive content hidden inside superhero and crime comics. The book landed at a moment of genuine, widespread American anxiety about post-war youth culture, and it triggered Senate subcommittee hearings on comic books and juvenile delinquency in April and June of 1954, hearings conducted with the kind of theatrical, career-making hostility that had already characterized so much of the era's congressional investigations into supposedly subversive cultural influences. Facing the very real threat of government regulation, the comic book industry did what a great many threatened industries in American history have done under similar pressure. It regulated itself first, fast, and severely, creating the Comics Code Authority in late 1954, a self-censorship body with sweeping restrictions on depicted violence, crime, horror content, and moral ambiguity, enforced through a seal of approval that most newsstand and drugstore distributors simply refused to carry comics without. The code didn't just tone down horror and crime titles, the genres it was ostensibly targeting. It flattened an enormous amount of the ambition and edge out of superhero comics generally for years afterward, pushing the entire industry toward a blander, more cautious, more explicitly reassuring tone that took roughly a decade and a half to meaningfully loosen. It's worth noticing the historical rhyme here because it's a genuinely striking one. The same young medium that had been brave enough in 1940 and 1941 to put a real, named, recognizable Adolf Hitler on a children's comic book cover and depict a hero punching him in the face months before the American government or a large share of the American public was willing to say the war needed fighting at all, that same medium was, a mere 13 years later, cowed into a period of extreme self-censorship by a very different domestic form of moral panic. One with far less basis in fact and considerably more basis in post-war American anxiety about youth culture, juvenile crime, and a rapidly changing society. The industry that had once been brave enough to receive death threats over its politics spent much of the following decade being extremely careful not to offend anyone at all. Jack Kirby, for his part, did not disappear during any of this the way the character he co-created briefly did. He kept working prolifically through the 1950s across genres, romance comics, westerns, science fiction, horror, building a career that would eventually, by the early 1960s, place him at the center of an entirely new explosion of superhero creativity at Marvel Comics, co-creating or substantially shaping an extraordinary run of now iconic characters including the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, the Hulk, and Thor, alongside writer and editor Stan Lee, in a burst of creative output between roughly 1961 and 1966 that reshaped the entire American comic book industry a second time. The scale and importance of Kirby's specific creative and storytelling contributions during this period, relative to the credit and compensation he actually received from the publisher at the time, would go on to become one of the longest, most contentious disputes in comic book history. A dispute that, in its broad shape, echoes an old and familiar pattern in American commercial art, a company benefiting enormously and durably from the work of a creator who did not, at the time, receive anything close to a proportional share of either the credit or the financial reward, a pattern that took Kirby and his family decades of advocacy, and in some cases formal legal action, to even partially address. Joe Simon, meanwhile, largely stepped back from mainstream superhero comics work for long stretches of the following decades, though he would later return, along with Kirby, to have his authorship of Captain America publicly and more fully acknowledged as the character's cultural importance was reassessed over time. Acknowledgement that, like so much else in this story, arrived years, sometimes decades, later than the actual contribution that earned it. There's something worth quietly noticing in this whole post-war chapter, something that doesn't get much attention in any version of this story built around battles and villains. The character created specifically to answer a moment of national moral clarity essentially could not survive the loss of that moral clarity. He needed a genuinely, unambiguously monstrous enemy and a country finally willing to name it as such in order to make sense. Once the war ended, and the country's attention shifted to a colder, murkier, more paranoid kind of conflict, one fought as much through suspicion of your own neighbours as through any battlefield. The simple shape of the character that had worked so well in 1941 didn't fit anymore, and for a long stretch of years, nobody quite knew what to do with him. He went, in the plainest possible sense, into a kind of hibernation of his own, not frozen in ice, just quietly out of print, waiting, the way a great many actual veterans of that war were also quietly waiting for a country to figure out what it wanted to say about what it had all meant. Chapter 11. The Thaw. The character finally properly returned in 1964, revived by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby within the new shared universe of Marvel superheroes Kirby was busy building at the time, with an origin retooled specifically to answer the one question the character's long absence had made unavoidable. Where had he actually been for nearly 20 years? The answer, suspended in ice since the final days of the war, discovered and revived by other superheroes in the present day, solved a genuine storytelling problem, but it also did something else, something that turns out to be a fairly precise piece of accidental cultural commentary. It made Captain America, structurally, into exactly what a great many actual veterans of that war quietly felt like they had become by the 1960s. A man built by one era's values, waking up into a country that had moved on without him, uncertain whether he still belonged in it or it in him. That tension became the character's defining engine for the following decade, and it tracked with a precision that seems almost too neat to be coincidental the real political disillusionment the country itself was working through. Stan Lee and later writers regularly had the character wrestle openly with whether the ideals he represented still matched the country he'd been reawakened into. A country now fighting an increasingly unpopular and divisive war in Vietnam, racked by the assassinations of John F. Kennedy in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, and both Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy within 2 months of each other in 1968, and convulsed by the civil rights movement's ongoing, unfinished confrontation with exactly the kind of segregated, unequal country the earlier chapters of this story have already spent time sitting with honestly. The most striking single example arrived in the mid-1970s, in a storyline commonly referred to as the Secret Empire arc, published in 1974, in which writer Steve Englehart had Captain America uncover a conspiracy reaching into the very highest levels of the United States government, a plot whose architect, in the story's climax, is revealed to be a disguised, unnamed figure occupying the Oval Office itself, who takes his own life rather than face exposure. This storyline was written and published in direct, deliberate, real-time parallel with the actual unfolding Watergate scandal, which forced President Richard Nixon's resignation in August of 1974, the same year the storyline concluded. Englehart has been candid in later interviews that the parallel was intentional, a direct response to watching the country's trust in its own government collapse in real time. The storyline's aftermath was even more striking than the plot twist itself. So disillusioned by these revelations that his own patriotic symbol had apparently been hiding rot at the very top of the government he represented, the character briefly abandons the Captain America identity altogether, operating for a stretch of subsequent issues under the name Nomad, a man without a country, a hero who no longer believed the symbol he'd been wearing meant what he'd always assumed it meant. It is genuinely remarkable, if you step back and look at it plainly, that a superhero comic aimed at a general audience was willing to stage, in near real time, its own flagship patriotic character having an actual public breakdown of faith in the American presidency in direct response to a real and ongoing constitutional crisis less than a decade after Wertham and the Comics Code had scared the entire industry into years of extreme caution. The medium that had once needed police protection for depicting a real dictator getting punched, and had then spent the 1950s terrified of depicting almost anything provocative at all, had found its way back, by the mid-1970s, to being willing to stage a genuinely pointed piece of contemporary political commentary through its single most patriotic character, Dietrich. Commentary aimed not outward at a foreign enemy this time, but inward at the country's own institutions, at exactly the moment those institutions had most spectacularly failed to live up to what they claimed to represent. This pattern, the character serving less as a fixed, static symbol of uncomplicated national pride, and more as a kind of ongoing barometer for the country's own evolving, often anxious relationship with its founding ideals, has repeated itself in different forms in nearly every subsequent decade of the character's publication history. He has been written giving up the identity in protest of government overreach more than once. He has been written confronting the country's history of slavery, segregation, and broken promises to its own soldiers of colour, most explicitly in the Isaiah Bradley story already discussed. He has been written, controversially and to considerable public backlash in 2017, as having secretly been a lifelong agent of a fictional fascist organisation his entire career, a twist deliberately engineered to provoke exactly the kind of visceral, personal outrage from readers that suggested, however uncomfortably, just how deeply invested several generations of Americans had become in this fictional character's specific, unwavering moral centre, and how much it genuinely unsettled people to imagine that centre compromised, even inside a story everyone understood would eventually reverse it. None of this happened, it's worth saying plainly, because the character was ever really about uncomplicated flag-waving in the first place, whatever his simplest cultural shorthand might suggest to someone who has never actually read one of these comics. He was built at the very start by two immigrant kids taking a real personal risk to argue for a specific contested political position in the middle of a genuine national argument about what the country's values actually required of it. Every major reinvention of the character in the 80-plus years since has, in its own way, returned to exactly that same original tension. What does it actually mean to represent a country's ideals honestly, especially in the moments when the country itself is falling well short of them? The Shield never really answered that question once and settled it. It has just kept getting asked again in every decade by every generation of writers who pick the character back up, because it turns out to be one of the very few genuinely durable questions in the entire mythology. Durable enough, apparently, to survive being frozen, thawed, disillusioned, unmasked, and reinvented over and over for the better part of a century. Chapter 12. What happened to the real generation? Step away from the character for a while now, and rest on the actual people this whole story has been standing next to the entire time. The 16 million Americans who served in uniform during World War II, and the tens of millions more, at home and abroad, whose lives the war reorganized permanently, whether or not they ever picked up a weapon at all. Most of them came home to an enormous, deliberate national effort to reabsorb them into civilian life, an effort embodied above all by the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, universally known as the GI Bill, which offered returning veterans funding for college or vocational training, low-interest loans to buy homes and start businesses, and unemployment benefits during the transition back into civilian work. It is difficult to overstate how thoroughly this single piece of legislation reshaped American life in the decades that followed. Millions of veterans who would otherwise never have been able to afford it attended college on the GI Bill, producing a dramatic, generation-defining expansion of the American middle class and reshaping higher education itself, as universities that had previously served a comparatively small, often wealthier population suddenly had to accommodate a flood of new students in their late 20s. Many of them married, many of them fathers already, all of them older and more serious than the typical pre-war undergraduate. The suburban housing boom of the late 1940s and 1950s, the tract house developments, the new highways connecting them, The whole post-war image of American domestic life that still shapes a lot of nostalgic imagination about the era was substantially fueled by GI Bill home loans. But it's essential in the same breath to say plainly that this transformative piece of legislation did not extend anything close to equal benefit to every veteran who had earned it. Because the GI Bill's provisions were administered locally, and because so much of Southern banking, real estate and higher education remained formally or informally segregated in the years immediately following the war, black veterans, men who had served in many cases in the same segregated units discussed earlier in this story, who had flown as Tuskegee Airmen, or driven trucks along the Red Ball Express, or fought with the 92nd Infantry through the Italian mountains, were frequently denied the same access to GI Bill college admissions, home loans, and business credit that white veterans of identical service records could access with comparative ease. Historians studying this gap have described it as one of the more significant, underappreciated engines of the racial wealth gap that persisted in American life for generations afterward, since home ownership and college education are among the most durable mechanisms by which American families historically built and passed down intergenerational wealth, and black veterans were substantially locked out of the exact program that built so much of white America's post-war prosperity, despite having served, fought, and in many cases bled for the same country under the same uniform. Women's roles during the war produced their own complicated, unfinished post-war reckoning. Over 6 million American women entered the industrial workforce during the war years, filling manufacturing and production jobs vacated by men who had gone to serve, epitomized culturally by the Rosie the Riveter image, and many of these women discovered real professional capability, independence, and income they had never previously had access to. When the war ended, a great many of these women were actively, sometimes forcibly, pushed back out of those same jobs to make room for returning male veterans, a reversal that a substantial number of women resisted or resented even as post-war cultural messaging worked hard to reframe returning to domestic life as the natural, desired outcome all along. The tension between what several million American women had proven themselves capable of during the war and the cultural pressure to set it aside afterward became one of the quieter, longer simmering sources of the women's movement that would fully emerge 2 decades later. And then there is the simplest, heaviest fact of all, the one no GI Bill or homecoming parade could touch. Just over 400,000 American service members did not come home at all, and worldwide, historians estimate the Second World War killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people in total, when military and civilian deaths, including the genocide of 6 million European Jews and millions of other victims of Nazi persecution, are counted together. A death toll so large it resists any real emotional comprehension, a number that exists mostly on paper, in the abstract, because no single human mind is built to hold the actual individual weight of that many extinguished lives at once. Every one of those deaths left behind an unfinished story that no piece of post-war legislation, no monument, no anniversary ceremony, and certainly no comic book was ever going to fully resolve. This is the actual scale the fictional character has always been standing in front of, whether any individual comic issue acknowledges it directly or not, an event so enormous that fiction can really only gesture toward its edges, using one imagined life, one imagined loss, one imagined homecoming as a kind of small, manageable doorway into something that in its true, full size simply cannot be held directly. That's not a criticism of the character or the choice to tell his story through the shorthand of a single soldier's journey. It might be the only honest way a story this size can be told at all. You pick one person. You follow him closely enough that his loss feels specific and real rather than statistical. And you trust the reader or the listener drifting towards sleep right now to understand that behind that one imagined life stand several 100,000 real ones, most of them nameless to you, all of them just as real, just as loved, just as unfinished as the fictional one the story chose to follow. Chapter 13, The War Fought with Words. No account of the shadow war behind this story would be honest if it stopped at commandos and saboteurs, because some of the most consequential fighting of the entire Second World War was never fought with a weapon at all. It was fought with language, mathematics, and an almost unimaginable amount of patient, invisible labour, much of it performed by people whose names were kept secret for decades after the war ended, in some cases for the rest of their lives. At Bletchley Park, a country estate in England requisitioned by British intelligence, a large and unusually assembled team of mathematicians, linguists, chess champions and crossword enthusiasts worked to break the German military's Enigma encryption system, a machine cipher the German High Command believed to be effectively unbreakable. Alan Turing, a mathematician whose theoretical work on computation would later be recognised as foundational to the entire field of computer science, was central to this effort, helping design the electromechanical devices known as bombs that could sift through the Enigma's staggering number of possible settings fast enough to make the code breaking operationally useful in real time rather than arriving too late to matter. Historians have since estimated that the intelligence produced at Bletchley Park, commonly referred to by the codename Ultra, shortened the war in Europe by a meaningful margin. Some estimates run as high as 2 years, and its existence was kept entirely secret from the public for nearly 3 decades after the war ended, meaning that a huge share of the people whose work may have done more than almost any single military campaign to shorten the war spent the rest of their working lives unable to tell anyone, including in many cases their own families, what they had actually done. Turing himself, despite this contribution, was later criminally prosecuted by his own government in 1952 under Britain's then existing laws against homosexuality, chemically castrated as an alternative to imprisonment, and died in 1954 in circumstances his inquest ruled a suicide. A bitter, almost unbearable postscript to a wartime contribution the country he'd served would not even formally apologise for until 2009, and would not issue a royal pardon for until 2013, nearly 60 years after his death. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific Theatre, the United States Marine Corps recruited several hundred Navajo men to serve as radio operators, using a code based on their own language. A language with no written form at the time, and one that, crucially, was not known to any Japanese cryptographers, making it functionally unbreakable by an enemy that had, up to that point, successfully cracked several earlier American military codes. The Navajo code talkers developed a specialised vocabulary within their own language for military terms that had no direct equivalent. A dive bomber, for instance, rendered through a Navajo word for hummingbird, and transmitted messages with a speed and accuracy that standard mechanical encryption devices of the era could not match. Message encoding and decoding that machines took 30 minutes to perform, a trained Navajo code talker could often complete in under 30 seconds. Major Howard Connor, signal officer during the brutal battle for Iwo Jima in early 1945, later said that the Marines could not have taken the island without the code talkers, whose transmissions ran continuously throughout that campaign, without a single one ever being broken by Japanese intelligence. And yet, for decades after the war, the program remained classified, meaning the code talkers were forbidden from discussing what they had actually done during their service, could not correct false or incomplete accounts of their own wartime record, and in many cases returned to a country that continued to suppress the use of Native American languages in the very schools their own children attended. An active federal and state policy throughout much of the 20th century aimed at eliminating indigenous languages that these same men had just used to help win a world war. The program was not declassified until 1968, and it was not until 2001 that the original 29 Navajo code talkers who developed the code were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, with additional code talkers who served later receiving Congressional Silver Medals, recognition that arrived, again and again in this story, only after most of the men who had earned it were already gone or very close to it. There is a particular, specific kind of irony sitting inside both of these stories that connects directly back to the central engine this whole video keeps returning to. The idea that the quality a person, or a country, dismisses, suppresses, or is ashamed of can turn out to be exactly the quality that saves it. Britain owed an enormous, quietly acknowledged debt to a gay mathematician its own laws would later criminalise and destroy. The United States owed an enormous, quietly acknowledged debt to indigenous languages. Its own policies spent generations trying to erase from native children's mouths in government-run boarding schools, some of those same policies still actively enforced during the very years the code talkers were using that language to save Marines' lives on Pacific beaches. In both cases, the thing that won a crucial piece of the war was precisely the thing the winning country was, at that exact moment, either persecuting or ashamed of. That's not a coincidence buried at the edge of this story. It might be the truest version of the central irony the whole mythology keeps circling, closer to the bone than any fictional serum or shield has ever managed to get. Let that settle too as you drift further down. Some of the most decisive victories of that war were won in silence, by people who were never allowed to talk about what they'd done, using gifts their own countries spent other parts of that same era trying to punish or erase. History does not always make this easy to hold. It rarely is. Chapter 14. The weakness the story never fully names. Every version of the Captain America origin runs on the same basic irony, the one that sits underneath the entire mythology, the way a foundation sits underneath a house nobody thinks about while they're living in it. Steve Rogers is chosen for the Super Soldier program specifically because of his weakness, not despite it. The version of the story usually told is that the scientist overseeing the program picks the frail, rejected volunteer over the bigger, stronger, more conventionally impressive candidates, precisely because a lifetime of being underestimated, being sickly, being the smallest kid in every room, has given him a depth of character, a stubborn refusal to back down from a fight he can't physically win, that the physically gifted candidates never had to develop because they never needed it. The strength was always secondary. The character was the actual ingredient. It's worth asking, gently, what real history this particular irony is standing on top of, because it turns out to be one of the more emotionally accurate pieces of the entire mythology, even though it's dressed up in the most fantastical packaging of the whole story. Consider how many of the people this true history has already introduced you to were, by the standards of their own era, considered unlikely, marginal, or explicitly unsuited for the role history ultimately handed them. The Tuskegee Airmen trained and flew combat missions specifically to disprove an official US military assessment that had concluded on paper that black men lack the intelligence and aptitude for combat aviation, and then went on to compile one of the most respected escort records of any fighter group in the entire war. The Navajo Code Talkers succeeded specifically because their language had been dismissed, suppressed, and treated as primitive and worthless by the same government that eventually depended on it to win battles no machine cipher could secure as effectively. Alan Turing was, by the rigid social standards of his own country and era, a criminal waiting to be discovered, and that same government's discomfort with who he was would eventually destroy him, even as his mind had already done more than almost any single individual to shorten the very war that made his country's survival possible. Charles Drew built the blood-banking infrastructure that kept a segregated army's wounded alive, while that same army's blood donation policy treated his own blood, by federal policy, as something to be kept separate. Over and over in the real history behind this story, the pattern repeats. The thing a country dismissed, feared, suppressed, or was ashamed of turned out to be exactly the thing that helped save it, and the people carrying that dismissed thing were, with remarkable consistency, not thanked for it in anything close to real time. Calvin Graham, 12 years old and undersized for even that, survived a naval battle that killed men 3 times his age, and was arrested for it rather than celebrated until decades of advocacy finally corrected the record. Vernon Baker waited 52 years for a medal that had been earned the moment it was earned. The Code Talkers waited until 1968 just to be allowed to say what they'd done out loud. This is, I think, the honest answer to why a story about a frail kid turned into the strongest man in the room has resonated for over 80 years with an audience that mostly has no direct memory of the actual war it was built to argue for. It isn't really a story about serums, it's a story about the particular, specific, very American fantasy that the thing making you feel small, unwanted, overlooked, or actively unwelcome might someday turn out to be exactly the thing the moment needs most, and quietly underneath that fantasy, a true and much less comfortable history of real people for whom that turn actually happened, and who mostly were not thanked, recognised, or repaid for it until long after it would have meant the most to hear it. The comic gives Steve Rogers his recognition immediately, cleanly, within the same origin story that establishes his weakness. That's the fiction's real kindness more than the strength itself. It closes the gap, the very long, very real, very common gap between the sacrifice and the acknowledgement of it, that almost none of the actual people behind this story were lucky enough to have closed so quickly, or, in some cases at all, within their own lifetimes. Chapter 15. What the war said it was for. Step back now, one more time, to the actual words the United States used at the highest level to explain to itself and the world why this war needed fighting at all. because those words turn out to sit in almost exactly the same uneasy, unresolved space as everything else in this story. A set of genuinely stirring ideals, articulated sincerely by a country that had not yet come close to living up to them, and in some respects still hasn't. In January of 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered his State of the Union address to Congress, nearly a full year before Pearl Harbor, at a moment when the isolationist argument discussed earlier in this story was still very much unresolved in American public life. In that speech, Roosevelt articulated what became known as the Four Freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, describing them as universal human entitlements that a world descending into fascism was actively extinguishing, and implicitly arguing that American security and American values could not be separated from the defence of those freedoms abroad. The speech became one of the defining rhetorical justifications for American involvement in the war, months before that involvement was forced by direct attack, and it was popular and effective enough that the artist Norman Rockwell later produced 4 now famous paintings, each illustrating one of the freedoms through a scene of ordinary American life, that were reproduced widely, used in a war bond tour, and remain some of the most recognisable pieces of American visual art from the entire era. It is worth sitting, honestly, with how large the gap was between those 4 freedoms, as stated, and the actual lived experience of a great many Americans in the very years this speech was being celebrated and toured around the country as a statement of national purpose. Freedom of speech did not extend in any meaningful practical sense to the many thousands of German-American Bund sympathisers whose politics this story has already discussed, nor, far more troublingly, to the more than 110,000 Japanese Americans who were stripped not of their speech but of their homes, their businesses, and their basic legal presumption of innocence, under an executive order signed the year after this speech, on the explicit grounds of ancestry alone, the majority of them native-born American citizens who had committed no crime and were never charged with one. Freedom from want rang differently, depending on which side of the country's segregated economy you were standing on, given the vast, well-documented gap in wages, housing access, and economic opportunity that separated black and white Americans throughout this entire era, a gap the post-war GI Bill, as already discussed, would go on to widen rather than close for millions of returning veterans. Freedom from fear meant something very different if you were a black family in the American South during these same years, where lynching, though declining in frequency from its peak decades earlier, remained a real and terrorising possibility, enforced with almost total legal impunity, alongside the daily grinding fear of Jim Crow's countless smaller humiliations and dangers. None of this means the Four Freedoms speech was cynical or hollow. By most historical accounts, Roosevelt meant it sincerely, and the speech genuinely did help shift American public opinion toward eventual involvement in a war against a set of regimes that were, without exaggeration or moral equivalence, actively engaged in exactly the kind of freedom-extinguishing violence the speech described. The point is something more specific, and, honestly, more useful than simple cynicism. The war was fought sincerely in the name of ideals the country fighting it had not yet earned the right to claim it was fully living up to, and in some cases was actively violating. In the very same years it made the loudest public claims to defending them. That gap, between the ideal stated and the reality lived, is not a footnote to this story. It might be the single most accurate thing you can say about the entire American experience of the Second World War, and it is, not coincidentally, the exact same gap that Captain America himself as a character has spent the better part of 80 years being written and rewritten to sit inside, sometimes comfortably, more often not. This is, in the end, probably the most honest way to understand why a fictional soldier in a flag has remained so durable a symbol for so long, across so many decades, through so many different rewritings of his politics, his teammates, his losses, his doubts. He was never actually a simple avatar of a country that had already gotten everything right. He was invented, at the very start, by people who understood better than almost anyone how far short of its own stated ideals the country was currently falling, and who drew him anyway, as an argument for what the country could still choose to become if enough people were willing to fight, in every sense of that word, for it. Every honest retelling of his story since has, whether consciously or not, kept circling back to that same original tension. It is very possibly the only part of this entire 85-year mythology that has never once needed updating. Chapter 16, What Remains. Almost every direct link to this true history is nearly gone now, and it's worth sitting with that plainly for a moment without flinching from it, because it's part of why a story like this one, told slowly, in the dark, matters more with each passing year rather than less. Of the roughly 16 million Americans who served in uniform during the Second World War, the US Department of Veterans Affairs has estimated that only a small fraction remained alive by the mid-2020s, a number that continues to fall by many hundreds each week, meaning that within a very short span of years from now, living first-hand memory of this war, the sound of it, the cold of it, the actual faces of the people who fought it, rather than the photographs and film reels that will outlast them, will have passed entirely out of reach, leaving only the record, the letters, the oral histories collected in the final years while there was still time, the documents, the medals awarded decades late, the wreckage still occasionally surfacing from melting glaciers, carrying a name home to a family that had stopped expecting one. This is, in its own way, the actual and much larger version of the frozen soldier image this whole story keeps circling back to. Not one man, preserved perfectly in ice, waiting to be thawed back into relevance by a future that still remembers exactly who he was. Something closer to the opposite, an entire enormous generation, gradually and permanently receding out of living memory, taking with it all the small, specific, unrecorded details that no history book ever quite manages to capture. The particular smell of a specific transport ship, the sound of a hometown accent from a soldier 2 bunks over, the private jokes, the exact texture of a fear that no documentary narration can fully reconstruct, because it was never really about the facts in the first place. It was about what it felt like to be there, and that part of it, the felt part, leaves with each person who carried it and does not come back. What does remain, and what this entire true history has been trying to hold up to the light for you tonight, are the facts underneath the feeling, the verifiable, documented shape of what actually happened, even once nobody is left who remembers living through it firsthand. 2 young Jewish artists really did risk real threats to draw a real dictator getting punched, 9 months before their own country agreed the fight was worth having. A 12-year-old really did survive a naval battle and get arrested for it. A segregated army really did produce some of its most celebrated pilots while denying them, for decades, the recognition their combat record had already, clearly, unambiguously earned. A mathematician who helped save an entire country was destroyed by that same country's laws within a decade of doing it. A code that helped win a Pacific Island campaign was built from a language the same government spent generations trying to erase from children's mouths. A blood banking system that saved uncounted thousands of wounded soldiers was built by a man whose own blood, by policy, was kept separate from the soldiers he was saving. None of these facts need a comic book to be true, and none of them became any less true in all the decades a lot of them spent forgotten, unrecognised or actively suppressed. But it's also fair to say, gently, that a story, even a fictional one, even one about a man in a flag who can lift more than any real person ever could, has a particular kind of power that a bare timeline of facts does not always manage on its own. It gives people a way back in. A reason to look up the real Tuskegee Airmen after watching a fictional integrated commando unit. A reason to ask what actually happened to Japanese Americans during a war so often remembered only through its uncomplicated victories. A reason even to lie here now, drifting towards sleep, letting all of this settle somewhere quiet instead of letting it simply become one more unremembered fact among 70 or 80 million others. That in the end might be the most honest use for a story like this one. Not to replace the real history underneath it. Nothing could and nothing should try. Just to hold a door open to it, gently, for as long as the door needs to stay open, until the last people who lived it are gone, and all that's left is whoever is still willing to walk back through, slowly, the way you're doing right now. Chapter 17. The 2 men who started it. Return now, near the end of this story, to the 2 young men this whole account began with, standing at a drafting table above a delicatessen in the winter of 1940, because their own later lives turned out to carry one more quiet echo of the very irony this whole mythology has been built on. The people who create the thing that endures are very often not the people. The credit or the reward arrives for first, or fastest, or most completely. Joe Simon left the character and the wider superhero genre behind for long stretches of the following decades, moving through other corners of publishing and advertising, and for years the public record of Captain America's creation credited him unevenly, sometimes barely at all, relative to how central his role in the character's invention, naming and early stories actually was. It was not until later in his life, as comic scholarship and fan research matured into something closer to a rigorous historical discipline in its own right, that Simon's full role was more widely and accurately understood and celebrated, including his part in the very specific, very risky editorial decision to put a real Hitler on that first cover. He lived to see the character become one of the central pillars of an entire multi-billion-dollar media franchise, and he lived to be publicly recognised, late but not too late, as one of its two originators, before his death in 2011 at the age of 98. Jack Kirby's story carries a heavier weight to it. His prolific, era-defining work throughout the 1960s at Marvel, not only on Captain America's revival, but on the creation or substantial co-creation of an extraordinary run of the medium's most enduring characters, was compensated, for most of his working life, on a page-rate basis common to the work-for-hire structure of the comics industry at the time, a structure that gave him no ownership stake, and, for decades, strikingly little formal creative credit relative to his actual contribution, a discrepancy that became one of the most sustained and consequential controversies in the entire history of American comics. Kirby spent years alongside his family after his death in 1994, pursuing recognition and compensation more commensurate with what he had actually built, a process that included formal legal disputes with the publisher over copyright termination rights that were not fully and finally resolved until a settlement reached with his estate in 2014, 20 years after his death and roughly 50 years after the creative work in question. He did live to see, before he died, the beginning of a wider critical and fan reassessment that named him, correctly, as one of the single most important and influential visual storytellers the medium had ever produced. But the fuller financial and contractual reckoning came only for the family he left behind, arriving decades after the drafting table nights that made it possible. There is no need to force too tidy a moral onto this, and it wouldn't be honest to try. It's simply one more instance sitting quietly at the very source of this entire story, of the same pattern this whole true history keeps returning to, again and again across every chapter. The contribution arrives first, often taking real courage or real risk to make in the moment it's made, and the full recognition of that contribution, if it comes at all, tends to arrive much later, sometimes so much later that the person who earned it is no longer there to receive it themselves. The Tuskegee Airmen, Vernon Baker, the Navajo Code Talkers, Alan Turing, posthumously pardoned, Calvin Graham, decades later reinstated, and now, sitting at the very root of the whole mythology, its own two creators, one of whom lived just long enough to see the reckoning begin, and one of whom did not. It's worth holding on to something else here too, though, something that isn't only sad. Both men, in their own ways, got to see the thing they made in that cold office in 1940 become something that mattered, not just commercially successful, though it became extraordinarily that, but something that people actually reached for, generation after generation, at moments when the country needed to have an argument with itself about what it was supposed to stand for. That is a very rare thing for any creative work to achieve, in any medium, in any era. Whatever the two of them were or weren't fairly paid or credited for along the way, they did get to watch the argument they started in 1940 keep being useful, keep being relevant, keep being picked back up by new writers in new decades facing new versions of the same old, unresolved American tension. Not every act of real courage gets rewarded fairly, but it isn't nothing either for it to still be doing exactly the work it was built for. 85 years and counting after two tired, broke, furious young men decided the country needed to hear something it wasn't ready yet to say out loud. Chapter 18, The Reversal, named plainly. By now, if you've stayed with this all the way through, or drifted in and out of it the way this kind of story is meant to be heard, a single shape has probably started to emerge underneath all the individual facts, and it's worth naming it plainly, once, before the very end. Almost everything real this story has touched runs on the same reversal. The frail kid turns out to be the right choice precisely because of his frailty. The dismissed, too passive flying style of the Tuskegee Airmen, the discipline of staying with the bombers instead of chasing individual glory, turns out to be exactly what made them the escorts crews requested by name. The suppressed, nearly erased Navajo language turns out to be the one code an entire enemy intelligence apparatus could never crack. The quiet, unglamorous work of blood plasma logistics turns out to matter more to how many soldiers survive a battlefield than almost any weapon fired on it. The comic book medium considered too disreputable, too childish, too beneath serious cultural notice to matter, turns out to be one of the only mainstream American art forms willing to take a real public stand against fascism before the country's own government was ready to. Over and over, across every real thread this story has pulled on, the quality that looked like weakness or embarrassment or something to be dismissed, hidden or erased, turns out on closer inspection to have been the actual source of whatever strength eventually followed it. That is not a coincidence of storytelling craft, and it isn't really a coincidence of history either, not exactly. It's closer to a pattern in how change tends to actually happen, in real, complicated, unglamorous life. The people and qualities a society is most confident it can safely dismiss are very often the exact reserve of strength that society ends up needing most, at the exact moment it can least afford to keep dismissing them. Nazi Germany's own ideology, built on the confident dismissal of entire categories of human beings as inferior, blinded it in ways that cost it dearly. A regime that persecuted and expelled Jewish scientists, some of whom went on to contribute meaningfully to Allied scientific efforts, is one of the starker, more specific examples of an enemy actively discarding exactly the kind of talent it would come to need and could no longer call on. None of this is offered as a comfortable, tidy lesson that everything works out, or that dismissal and suppression are somehow secretly good for the people who endure them, because that would be a lie, and a fairly ugly one. Vernon Baker did not need to wait 52 years for his medal, in order for his heroism to have been real the moment he showed it. The wait was not a necessary ingredient in the story. It was simply an injustice. Full stop. One that happened to eventually get partially corrected while he was still alive to receive it, which is more than a great many others in this story ever got. The lesson, if there is one worth taking to sleep with you tonight, is smaller and a little more modest than everything works out. It's closer to this. The things a country or an institution or a person tells itself are its weaknesses are worth a second, closer, more honest look, because the historical record, again and again, across dozens of completely unrelated corners of a single 6-year war, suggests that confidence about what strength is supposed to look like is one of the most reliably unreliable judgments people make, right up until the moment reality corrects it for them, often at a cost that a little more humility, a little earlier, might have avoided. Captain America in the fiction gets that reversal handed to him cleanly, in a single origin story on a single night, in a lab that no longer exists by the time the story is finished being told. The real history underneath him took 85 years, and counting to even partially unevenly acknowledge the same reversal in the actual people who lived it, and for a great many of them, the acknowledgement either arrived far too late to matter to the person who earned it, or hasn't fully arrived yet at all. That gap between the clean fictional version and the slow, uneven, still unfinished real one is not a flaw in the story. It might be the entire reason the story has been worth telling and retelling for this long. Chapter 19 to the real beach. So much of this character's visual identity, the shield raised against incoming fire, the beach landing, the wave after wave of soldiers moving forward into something that should, by any reasonable measure, be unsurvivable, sits directly on top of a single real morning that has become, in the decades since, one of the most studied and most mythologized events of the entire war. June 6th, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy, universally remembered simply as D-Day. Roughly 156,000 Allied troops landed on or near the beaches of Normandy on that single day, delivered by nearly 7,000 vessels and supported by more than 11,000 aircraft, in the largest seaborne invasion in human history, a scale of coordinated logistics that had never been attempted before and in that specific form has never needed to be attempted since. The operation had been delayed a full day by poor weather, and even once it launched, conditions in the English Channel remained rough enough that many landing craft took on water, and a significant number of soldiers arrived at the beaches already seasick, exhausted, and soaked through, hours before they ever faced enemy fire at all. The 5 landing beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau and Sword, saw dramatically different fates that morning. At Omaha Beach, assigned primarily to American forces, the combination of unexpectedly strong German defensive positions, difficult terrain, and landing craft that in some cases dropped soldiers too far from shore, in water too deep and too rough to cross safely produced catastrophic casualties within the first hours of the assault. Some individual companies suffered casualty rates estimated at over 60% before they had even managed to clear the beach itself. Men cut down by machine gun fire from fortified positions on the bluffs above before they could find any real cover at all. Estimates of total Allied casualties on D-Day itself run to around 10,000, with roughly a quarter of that number killed outright, a single day's toll that remains almost impossible to hold in the mind at the scale of any individual imagined life, in exactly the way this whole story has kept returning to. And yet, by the end of that day, despite the catastrophic losses at Omaha in particular, the Allies had established a foothold on all 5 beaches, and within the following weeks, over 2 million additional Allied troops and hundreds of thousands of vehicles would pour through the beachhead this first, brutal wave had purchased, beginning the campaign that would liberate Western Europe over the following 11 months. The soldiers who survived that first wave at Omaha, in particular, are remembered by military historians as having accomplished something close to the outer edge of what determined, terrified, ordinary human beings are capable of under fire, not because any of them were superhuman, but specifically because none of them were. They were fishermen and farm boys and factory workers and college dropouts, the vast majority of them barely into their 20s, who kept moving forward across open sand under machine gun fire because the men beside them were doing the same thing, and because turning back on that particular beach on that particular morning was in most places no safer than continuing on. It's worth sitting for a moment with how strange it is that the popular imagination of this single morning, through decades of films, documentaries, and yes, through characters like the one at the centre of this story, has become one of the most heroic, almost mythic images in modern Western memory, while the actual lived experience of it for the men who were there was overwhelmingly one of confusion, terror, seasickness, and, for a great many of them, a death that arrived within minutes of stepping off a landing craft, before they'd fired a single shot of their own, sometimes before they'd even managed to find where their own unit had scattered to in the chaos of the landing. The myth remembers a beach that was won. The men who were actually on it mostly remember a beach that, in the moment, felt like it could not possibly be survived by anyone for any reason. Both things are true at once, and that particular doubling, the genuine earned heroism of what was actually accomplished, sitting directly on top of the genuine unglamorous terror of what it actually felt like to accomplish it, might be the single most important thing to carry out of this chapter and into the rest of this story. The shield raised against incoming fire is a beautiful, simple image. The real beach it stands in for had no shields at all, just men and sand and machine gun fire and each other, and somehow, by the end of one impossibly long morning, a foothold that the rest of the war would be built on. Chapter 20. The Unfinished Reckoning. After the shooting stopped, there was still the question of what to do with the people who had built and run the machinery of the atrocity, and the answer the Allies settled on, in the city of Nuremberg beginning in late 1945, was itself a genuinely unprecedented and, in its own way, deeply imperfect experiment, putting surviving senior Nazi leadership on public trial under newly articulated legal principles for crimes that in some cases had no clear precedent in existing international law at all for it. 24 of the most senior surviving Nazi officials were indicted in the first and most famous of the Nuremberg trials, on charges including crimes against peace, war crimes, and, in a legal category essentially invented for the occasion, crimes against humanity, a term coined specifically because existing law had no adequate category for what the tribunal's prosecutors were attempting to describe. The deliberate, industrialized extermination of an entire people, carried out not as a side effect of war but as a central planned objective of the regime that waged it. 12 of those first defendants were sentenced to death. Others received prison terms of varying length. 3 were acquitted outright, a verdict that remains debated by historians to this day. Adolf Hitler himself, along with several of his closest inner circle, never stood trial at all, having died by suicide in the final days of the war rather than face capture. A detail that means the single figure most singularly responsible for the war's origin and the Holocaust's execution never had to answer, in any courtroom, for either. The trials that followed over the coming years reached further down into the machinery of the regime. Doctors who had conducted the medical experiments discussed earlier in this story, judges who had enforced Nazi race laws from the bench, industrialists who had profited from slave labour extracted from camp prisoners, and, notably, a set of trials devoted specifically to the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units responsible for mass shootings of Jewish civilians across occupied Eastern Europe well before the extermination camps were fully operational, a phase of the Holocaust sometimes referred to by historians as the Holocaust by bullets, responsible on its own for well over 1 million deaths. But the reckoning was never close to complete, and it's important, in the interest of the same honesty this whole account has tried to maintain throughout, to say so plainly. A great many perpetrators, at every level of the regime's hierarchy, were never identified, never tried, or were tried and given sentences that later generations of historians and survivors alike have judged shockingly, sometimes grotesquely lenient given the scale of what they had participated in. Some fled to South America and elsewhere, living out full lives under false names, occasionally tracked down decades later. Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal logistical architects of the Holocaust deportation system, was located in Argentina and captured by Israeli intelligence agents in 1960, 15 years after the war's end, and tried in Jerusalem in a proceeding that brought the full scope of the Holocaust's bureaucratic machinery into public view in a way the original Nuremberg trials, focused more narrowly on top leadership, had not fully managed to do. Josef Mengele, the physician responsible for some of the most horrifying medical experiments conducted at Auschwitz, was never captured at all, living under assumed identities in South America until his death by drowning in Brazil in 1979, having evaded justice completely for the entirety of his natural life. West Germany's own post-war reckoning with this history was itself slow, contested and uneven for decades, with a great many former Nazi Party members and even some implicated officials quietly rejoining civilian professional life, including in government and the judiciary, in the years immediately following the war, a pattern that a later generation of German historians, journalists, and most visibly, the German student movements of the late 1960s would openly and angrily confront their parents' generation about, demanding a more honest and complete accounting than the immediate post-war years had actually delivered. This is, in the end, one more version of the same unfinished shape this entire story keeps returning to, chapter after chapter. Victory arrived cleanly, on a specific date, with a specific surrender document. Justice, accountability, and reckoning arrived slowly, unevenly, incompletely, over decades, and in some individual cases, Mengele's for one, never arrived at all in any form a survivor could point to and call closure. The fictional version of this story tends to end on the clean version, the surrender, the victory, the shield lowered at last. The real history it's standing on top of kept going messily for decades afterward, and in some quiet specific ways, in ongoing legal and historical work to identify the last perpetrators and fully document what happened to the last unnamed victims. It is, in certain corners, still going on right now, tonight, while you rest. Chapter 21, The Monuments We Built Afterward. In the decades since the war ended, the countries that fought it have built an enormous, ongoing physical vocabulary of remembrance. Cemeteries, memorials, museums, and preserved sites. And it's worth spending a little time, near the close of this story, simply describing a few of them, quietly, the way you might describe a place to someone falling asleep beside you who has never been there. The Normandy American Cemetery, overlooking Omaha Beach on the bluffs the surviving soldiers of that first wave eventually managed to climb, holds the graves of just over 9,300 American service members, most of whom died in the invasion and the subsequent campaign to secure the beachhead, their white marble crosses and stars of David arranged in long, precise rows across a green lawn above the same water so many of them crossed under fire. A visitor walking those rows in silence, reading name after name after name, unit after unit, home state after home state, experiences something that no single statistic, however large, quite manages to convey on its own. The sheer, specific, individual scale of it. one marker at a time, each one representing a life that had a beginning, a family, a set of small daily habits and preferences and private jokes that ended all at once on a beach or in a hedgerow or a farmhouse somewhere in the fields beyond it. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., opened in 1993, was built specifically to ensure that the direct physical and testimonial evidence of the Holocaust, evidence General Eisenhower had insisted on documenting extensively in 1945 precisely because he feared a future in which it might be denied, would remain accessible and undeniable long after the last survivors were gone, incorporating survivor testimony recorded across the following decades specifically because the museum's planners understood, even in the early 1990s, that living memory of the event had a finite and shrinking window in which to be captured directly in the survivors' own voices before it passed entirely into second-hand and third-hand account. Yad Vashem, Israel's own central Holocaust remembrance authority, established in Jerusalem in 1953, maintains an ongoing, still unfinished project to identify and record the name of every individual victim of the Holocaust, a database that, more than 70 years after the war's end, still contains millions of names, but remains, by its own administrator's account, incomplete, meaning that even now, in the present moment, researchers continue the slow work of recovering names that would otherwise have vanished from any record at all, an effort that connects directly back to the same instinct this entire story keeps circling, the fear and the fight against the fear that an atrocity this large might eventually be reduced to an abstraction, a round number, rather than remaining what it actually was, which is millions of specific, individually irreplaceable human beings, each with a name worth recovering and saying, even this many decades later, even to an audience that will mostly never know most of those names personally. Smaller, quieter memorials exist by the thousands, scattered across small towns in the United States and the countries the war touched. A single name added to a town square's existing war memorial. A plaque in a high school hallway listing the names of graduates who did not come home. A stained glass window in a church funded by a family that lost a son and wanted some small, permanent place for his name to remain visible to people who never knew him. These smaller memorials rarely draw the crowds that Normandy or the National Mall draw, but they perform, in miniature, exactly the same function. A refusal to let a specific, individual loss dissolve entirely into the enormous, abstract total. There's a reason this kind of remembrance work tends to accelerate, rather than fade, as the direct living witnesses to an event grow fewer, a reason museums specifically raced, in the final years when it was still possible, to record as much first-hand survivor and veteran testimony as they could, understanding that this specific, irreplaceable kind of evidence, a living voice describing a lived experience in their own words, cannot be recreated or recovered once it's gone, in the way that a document or a photograph, imperfect as those are too, at least persists on paper. What remains after that window closes is exactly what this whole account has been assembling for you tonight. The documented facts, the recovered names, the medals awarded late, the wreckage still occasionally surfacing from a melting glacier, and the stories, including, yes, the fictional ones, the comic books and the films built from them, that keep pointing back, generation after generation, to the true history sitting quietly underneath them, waiting for whoever is still willing to go looking for it. Chapter 22, The Character Now. By the time Captain America reappeared on movie screens for a new generation, beginning most prominently with a 2011 film set explicitly during the Second World War, before carrying the character forward into the present day, across a decade and a half of subsequent films, the audience receiving him had almost no living connection left to the war that created him. Most viewers in the theatre had never met a World War II veteran who could describe it to them directly. For a large share of the youngest viewers, even their grandparents had been born after the war ended, meaning the whole conflict had, for them, already become something closer to distant history than lived family memory, the way the First World War had become for the generation that created the character back in 1940. And yet the films leaned, deliberately and repeatedly, on the same historical texture this whole account has spent its time on. The visual language of a 1940s New York, the war bond tours, the multinational commando unit standing in for the real shadow war fought by the OSS and the Jedburgh teams and the Devil's Brigade, the the frozen recovery decades later standing in for the real, quieter stories of wreckage surfacing from melting ice with a name finally attached to it. The filmmakers clearly understood, whether or not every individual audience member consciously registered it, that the reason this specific character kept working era after era wasn't really the strength or the shield. It was the fact that he remained one of the very few enduring popular fictional figures built to hold, honestly, generation after generation, the actual weight and complexity of what that war cost and what it claimed to be fighting for, and how far short of that claim the country fighting it kept falling even as it fought. Subsequent films and comics continued the character's long tradition of using him as a barometer for the country's ongoing, unresolved relationship with its own ideals, rather than a simple, static mascot for them. Storylines addressing government surveillance overreach, the ethics of extrajudicial action, the question of who gets to decide what protecting the country actually means in a given decade, and repeatedly, explicit and pointed engagement with the character's own complicated racial history, including, in the comics, a period in which a black character, Sam Wilson, took up the shield and the mantle entirely, explicitly foregrounding exactly the kind of tension this whole account has spent so much time sitting with honestly. What does it mean for this specific symbol, invented by immigrant Jewish artists as an argument against fascism, tested in fiction on black bodies without consent in an explicit echo of Tuskegee, denied for decades any honest reckoning with the segregated army it claimed to represent, to finally explicitly be carried by a black man? And what does the reaction to that choice from different parts of the audience reveal about how far the country has or hasn't actually come since 1941? None of this happened because a corporation calculated it would be the most commercially cautious choice available. A great deal of it, at various points, generated real public controversy and real backlash, in a pattern that, if you've been paying attention through this whole account, should feel familiar by now, because it's the same pattern that met the character on his very first cover in December 1940. The character that started as an argument, taking real risk to make a real point before it was safe or popular to make it, has kept being written generation after generation by people willing to let him keep being exactly that. An argument made in public, sometimes at real cost, rather than a settled, comfortable symbol everyone already agrees about. That is, in the end, probably the most useful thing to understand about why this specific character, out of the enormous crowded field of 20th century patriotic fictional soldiers most countries produced during and after their own wars, is one of the very few that has remained genuinely alive, genuinely contested, genuinely capable of provoking real argument 85 years after two broke, furious young men first drew him, swinging a punch at a real dictator on a real magazine cover for an American public that, at the time, was not at all sure it wanted to hear what they were saying. He was never actually built to be comfortable. He was built to be right before it was safe to be, and every honest version of his story since has tried, with varying success, to hold on to that same original nerve. Chapter 23, The Real Men Behind the Mask. No honest account of this story can skip past the villains entirely, because the fictional ones, the sinister scientist running a secret weapons program, the calculating propaganda chief, the ideologue convinced of his own civilization's manufactured superiority, were not invented from nothing either. They were assembled, consciously or not, from a real cast of actual men who built and ran the machinery the fiction spent decades punching. Joseph Goebbels, Germany's Reich Minister of Propaganda, ran one of the most sophisticated and comprehensive state propaganda operations in modern history, controlling film, radio, print, and public spectacle with a level of centralized coordination that turned lies into a kind of industrial product, manufactured and distributed at national scale. Goebbels understood, with real and chilling clarity, that repetition and emotional manipulation mattered more to public persuasion than factual accuracy. A lesson his ministry applied relentlessly across every available medium, dehumanizing Jewish people and other targeted groups in official state media for years before the machinery of mass murder was fully built, laying the psychological groundwork that made the later atrocities possible for ordinary citizens to participate in, tolerate, or simply look away from. He died by suicide alongside his wife in the same Berlin bunker as Hitler in the final days of the war, after the two of them killed their 6 young children, rather than let them live in a world without the regime the family had served. Heinrich Himmler ran the SS, the organisation most directly responsible for administering the concentration and extermination camp system, overseeing an apparatus of surveillance, terror and industrialised killing that extended across the entirety of Nazi-controlled Europe. Himmler was also personally responsible for authorising and overseeing many of the medical experimentation programmes discussed earlier in this account, treating camp prisoners as a disposable research population for German military medical science. He was captured by British forces in the final days of the war and died by suicide, using a concealed cyanide capsule within hours of his capture before he could be formally tried. Josef Mengele, already mentioned in an earlier chapter, personally selected which arriving prisoners at Auschwitz would be sent immediately to the gas chambers and which would be kept alive for forced labour or for his own personal unconsented medical experimentation, particularly on twins, whom he had a specific and horrifying fixation on studying, experiments that produced no legitimate scientific value whatsoever and left an untold number of children dead or permanently maimed. He evaded capture for the rest of his life, a fact this account has already sat with, and it remains one of the starker examples in this entire story of a central architect of real atrocity facing no formal justice at all. It is worth being precise and careful here, in a way fiction is not always required to be. The actual machinery of the Holocaust and the broader Nazi war effort was not run by a single moustache-twirling mastermind in a hidden base, the way a comic book villain often is. It was run by thousands of ordinary bureaucrats, engineers, train schedulers, accountants and mid-level officials, most of whom never appeared in any newsreel, and are remembered, if at all, only through the paperwork they left behind. Men who processed deportation manifests, calculated freight capacity for trains carrying human beings to their deaths, or approved procurement orders for the chemical agents used in the gas chambers, treating an atrocity of unprecedented scale as a logistics problem to be solved efficiently. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt, covering the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, coined the phrase "the banality of evil" specifically to describe this unsettling reality. That Eichmann, one of the primary logistical architects of the Holocaust's deportation system, presented in the courtroom not as a monstrous, obviously deranged figure, but as a startlingly ordinary, almost bureaucratic personality, a man who spoke of his role in the murder of millions in the flat, procedural language of a mid-level administrator discussing a difficult scheduling problem. That fact, that the real machinery of this atrocity ran overwhelmingly on ordinary human bureaucratic participation rather than singular theatrical villainy, is genuinely harder to sit with than any fictional villain, because it offers no clean, isolated figure to defeat and no tidy ending once that figure is gone. It suggests instead something closer to a warning about how easily large-scale atrocity can be built out of thousands of small, individually rationalised administrative choices made by people who mostly did not think of themselves as monsters at all. The fictional villain gives you someone to punch, and the punch resolves something. The real history gives you a bureaucracy, and there is no single knockout blow available against a bureaucracy. Only the slow, ongoing, unglamorous work of naming what happened accurately, trying the people who can still be found and tried, and building the kind of institutional and cultural memory strong enough to make the next bureaucracy think twice. Let that sit too, as this story nears its end. The comic gives you a villain shaped like a man, because a man is something a hero can actually fight. The real history gave the world something far larger, far more diffuse, and far harder to defeat cleanly, which might be exactly why the world still needed, and still needs, an entire century of retellings, arguments and reminders, fictional and otherwise, to keep from looking away from it again. Chapter 24, The Morning That Ended the Argument. Return near the close of this account to the single morning that ended the argument this whole story began with, the debate over whether America should fight at all, because it deserves more than the passing mention it received earlier, and because what followed it, at home, is one of the harder, less comfortable threads in this entire true history. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese naval aircraft launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, sinking or damaging 19 naval vessels, including 4 battleships, destroying nearly 200 aircraft, most of them caught still on the ground, and killing 2,403 Americans in a span of under 2 hours, the overwhelming majority of them sailors caught aboard the battleship USS Arizona, which was struck by a bomb that detonated its forward ammunition magazine, killing nearly 1,100 crew members instantly and sinking the ship where it sat, its wreck remaining on the harbour floor to this day, a designated memorial and, for the sailors still entombed within it, an actual grave. The attack was launched without a formal declaration of war preceding it, a fact President Roosevelt referenced directly the following day in his address to Congress, describing December 7th as a date which will live in infamy, and requesting, and receiving within hours, a formal declaration of war against Japan, with Germany and Italy declaring war on the United States days later, resolving in a single week an isolationist debate that had consumed the country for over 2 years. The immediate domestic response to Pearl Harbor, beyond the declaration of war itself, included one of the most significant civil liberties violations in modern American history, and it deserves to be described plainly and in full, rather than folded into a single sentence the way it sometimes is in shorter retellings. In February 1942, roughly 10 weeks after the attack, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing military commanders to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded, a deliberately broad authorization that was applied, in practice, almost exclusively to people of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of the United States. Over the following months, more than 110,000 people, the substantial majority of them American citizens by birth, including infants, children, and elderly people who had lived in the country for decades, were forcibly removed from their homes, given only days or at most weeks to sell or abandon homes, farms, businesses and possessions built up over entire lifetimes, and relocated to a network of hastily constructed incarceration camps in remote, often harsh inland locations, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, where many families remained for up to 3 years. No individual charges were filed against any of the people incarcerated under this order. No trials were held. No specific evidence of espionage or sabotage by any Japanese American citizen was ever produced to justify the policy at the time, and a formal US government commission that later reviewed the decision in a 1983 report concluded plainly that the incarceration had been driven not by military necessity, but by, in the commission's own language, race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Fred Korematsu, a young Japanese-American man who refused to comply with the relocation order and was subsequently arrested and convicted, challenged the policy's constitutionality all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1944, in the case Korematsu versus United States, upheld the incarceration as a valid exercise of wartime authority, a ruling that stood as legal precedent for decades and that the Supreme Court did not formally, explicitly repudiate until 2018 in an unrelated case, when the sitting Chief Justice wrote that Korematsu had been gravely wrong the day it was decided, and had already been repudiated in the court of history. And here, once more, this account arrives at the same reversal it keeps circling. Even while incarcerated behind barbed wire by their own government, on the explicit basis of their ancestry alone, thousands of young Japanese-American men volunteered for military service, forming the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a segregated Japanese-American unit that went on to fight with such distinction in the Italian and French campaigns that it became, by the war's end and by every subsequent formal accounting, the most highly decorated unit for its size and length of service in the entire history of the United States military, earning over 4,000 Purple Hearts, and, decades later, following a formal review that echoed the same delayed recognition pattern already seen with Vernon Baker and the Tuskegee Airmen, 21 Medals of Honor, most of them awarded or upgraded in 2000, more than half a century after the actions that earned them. Many of these soldiers fought while their own parents, siblings and children remained incarcerated back home for the entire duration of their service, a fact their commanding officers and eventually the wider American public came to regard as one of the most striking demonstrations of loyalty and courage of the entire war. Loyalty demonstrated toward a country that had, at that exact moment, formally declared their own families a suspected threat to it. It would take until 1988, 46 years after Executive Order 9066, for the United States government to formally apologize for the incarceration and provide reparations payments to surviving individuals who had been detained under the Civil Liberties Act signed by President Reagan. Recognition that, in the now familiar rhythm of this entire account, arrived only after most of the people it was meant to address had already lived out the majority, and in many cases the entirety of their lives without it. Carry this one gently, if you carry it at all tonight. It sits at the exact centre of everything this story has been trying to hold honestly. A country, attacked without warning, uniting almost overnight behind a war fought explicitly in the name of freedom, while turning, within 10 weeks of that same attack, to strip freedom from over 100,000 of its own people, on no evidence at all, and then watching some of those same people volunteer to fight and die for the country that had done it to them anyway, becoming, by any fair measure, some of the very best soldiers that country produced in the entire war. If there is a single true story in this whole account that holds the entire central irony in one place, all at once, without needing a single fictional shield to illustrate it, it might be this one. Chapter 25. How the war actually ended. One more piece of the real ending deserves its place here, quietly, before this story lets you go, because the war's actual conclusion looked nothing like the clean surrender ceremony that closes most retellings, and it's worth knowing, gently, what that conclusion actually cost. By the summer of 1945, with Germany already defeated, Japan continued fighting despite a military position that Allied planners assessed as increasingly hopeless, and the prospect of a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation planners codenamed Downfall, was projected in various military estimates to potentially cost hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties, and a far larger number of Japanese military and civilian deaths, based partly on the ferocity of the fighting already seen at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese resistance had continued in some cases to the near-total loss of defending garrisons rather than surrender. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly, with tens of thousands more dying in the following months and years from burns, injuries and radiation exposure, bringing total estimated deaths from the single bombing, by the end of that year, to somewhere in the range of 140,000 people. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 to 70,000 people by the end of 1945 through the same combination of the initial blast and its slower aftermath. These remain, to this day, the only two nuclear weapons ever used in warfare against another country, and the moral and strategic debate over the decision to use them, whether they were necessary to end the war without an invasion, whether a demonstration or a warning might have achieved surrender without direct use against civilian populations, whether the timing was influenced by a desire to demonstrate the weapon to the Soviet Union as the post-war order began taking shape, remains genuinely, seriously contested among historians to this day, without a single settled consensus answer, and it would not be honest for this account to pretend otherwise, or to hand you a tidy resolution to a question that serious, careful people still actively disagree about. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th, 1945, 6 days after Nagasaki, and the formal surrender document was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, finally, formally ending the Second World War in its entirety, nearly 4 months after the celebrations of VE Day that this account already described as incomplete. For the millions of Allied servicemen who had spent the summer of 1945 dreading redeployment to the Pacific for a feared invasion, the sudden Japanese surrender arrived as an almost disorienting relief, cutting short a war many of them had genuinely believed they might not survive. The full human cost of the atomic bombings, and of the broader firebombing campaigns that had already devastated dozens of Japanese cities in the preceding months, including a single raid on Tokyo in March 1945, that is estimated to have killed roughly 100,000 people in a single night through fire alone, sits in an uneasy, largely unresolved place within American public memory even now, 8 decades later, remembered by many as the necessary, if terrible, price of ending a war that would otherwise have cost far more lives on both sides, and remembered by others, including a great many historians and, understandably, a great many Japanese survivors and their descendants, as a civilian atrocity whose necessity has never been adequately proven, and whose scale deserves a far more uncomfortable reckoning than it has generally received in the victor's version of the story. Both positions are held today by serious, careful people working from the same available evidence, and this account will not pretend to settle a question that the actual historical record does not settle cleanly either. What is not contested is the scale of what those 2 mornings in August 1945 actually did to 2 ordinary cities full of ordinary people going about ordinary days. A scale that, once again, resists easy comprehension, the way so much of this entire 6-year war does. And that closed the conflict not with the clean finality of a surrender ceremony alone, but with an opening of an entirely new kind of danger, the nuclear age that the world has now lived inside uneasily for the entire span of time since, right up through the night you are falling asleep in now. Let the war end here, the way it actually did, not simply, not without cost, not without an argument that continues quietly in serious rooms to this day, just ended finally after 6 years, at a cost that no single number, however large, has ever managed to hold completely. Coulda. So let it rest there now, as the story closes and you drift the rest of the way down. A shield is not a serum, and a serum was never real, and no single soldier ever woke up from decades in the ice to finish a fight he never got to finish. But underneath that shield this whole account has tried to show you sits an almost unbearable amount of real, documented, specific human history. 2 immigrant artists who took a real risk to draw a real argument before their country agreed with it. A boy of 12 who lived through a naval battle and was punished instead of thanked. Pilots who flew brilliantly to disprove a slander written about them in an official report. A code built from a language a government spent generations trying to erase. A mathematician who helped save a country that later destroyed him for who he was. A blood bank built by a man his own army wouldn't let give blood to the soldiers he was saving. A beach that could not, by any reasonable measure, have been survived, and somehow, barely, was. The thesis of this whole story was never really about a serum making a weak man strong. It was about how often, in the actual, true, documented record of that war, the quality a country was most confident it could safely dismiss. A small body, a suppressed language, a forbidden identity, a segregated unit, a disreputable medium for children, turned out to be exactly the thing that quietly saved it. Usually without thanks, usually without recognition, usually not until decades after it would have meant the most to hear it. That is the real story sitting underneath the comic book. That is the true history behind Captain America. If any of it stayed with you tonight, a name, a beach, a frozen aircraft still being recovered from a glacier somewhere in the present tense, right now, while you rest, let it settle in gently rather than sharply, the way all of this deserves to be carried, not as a fact to perform or repeat, just as something true, held quietly, the way the people in this story mostly had to hold what they carried, for far too long, largely alone. It is worth remembering, too, that this account has only been able to follow a handful of threads out of a war that touched, in one way or another, nearly every family on Earth. There were resistance fighters in occupied France and Poland and Yugoslavia and the Philippines, whose names never made it into any Allied after-action report at all. There were merchant mariners who crossed the U-boat-infested North Atlantic in unarmed cargo ships to keep Britain fed and supplied, suffering, proportionally, some of the highest casualty rates of any American service branch in the entire war, and who were not even formally recognised as veterans by the United States government until 1988, decades after the fact, in the same slow rhythm this whole account keeps circling back to. There were prisoners of war held in brutal conditions in the Pacific Theatre, survivors of forced marches and slave labour in Japanese custody, whose stories remain, for a great many Americans, one of the least well-known chapters of the entire war. There were entire occupied countries whose civilian populations endured years of requisition, starvation, and reprisal killing that this account has barely had room to gesture toward. None of these threads made it into the fictional shorthand of a single soldier in a flag, and that isn't a failure of the fiction so much as an honest limit of what any single story, however long, can actually hold. A war this size will always have more true stories underneath it than any one account, however many hours long, could ever finish telling. There is one last thing worth saying before the quiet fully takes over, and it is not really a fact at all, just an observation offered gently. Almost none of the people in this story knew, while they were living it, that any of it would matter this much, this long afterward. The 2 young men at the drafting table did not know their argument would still be having itself, in new forms 85 years later. The 12-year-old on the battleship did not know his court-martial would one day be reversed by a country that had grown, slowly, a little more willing to admit it had been wrong. The men crossing that beach under fire did not know which of them would still be remembered by name, on a bluff above the water, generations after they fell. Almost nobody in this entire account was living inside a story yet. They were just living, as carefully and as bravely as they could manage, inside a set of ordinary, terrifying, unresolved days, one after another, without the comfort of knowing how any of it would eventually be told. That is, in the end, probably true of whatever ordinary unresolved day you're ending right now, as you finally let this story go. You don't have to know yet what any of it adds up to. Almost nobody in this account did either, while they were living the parts of it that turned out eventually decades later to matter most. Rest now. There's another true story like this one waiting whenever you're ready for it. This one is finished. Sleep well.